My name is Tony Levitas. I'm a senior fellow at the Watson Institute, and for the last 5 or 6 years have had the great pleasure of leading one of the 2 thesis seminars for the group of Watson undergraduate concentrations. This is the last year of the public policy concentration and the IR concentration, international relations concentration. There are 3 students from public policy, 2 from IR, but the rest are all from IAPA. And as you will see, the international and public affairs concentration of the Watson Institute, the work is really remarkable. It spans the globe. We address, or the students' work addresses really important problems on every continent and really across a variety of historical periods, from the contemporary to the colonial. This is not a thesis defense. This is really a celebration of students' work. As you'll see, it's really fantastically well developed. We have quantitative, qualitative, deeply historical studies. And what we're going to do today is have 3 panels. Today is Making Foreign Policy, Migration, Immigration, and Protection, and In the Shadow of Hegemons. The procedure will be that each student will have 10 to 12 minutes to present their work. And when all the presentations are done, we'll take questions from the floor. Let me take this opportunity to really thank the Watson community as a whole for supporting this work, particularly to the readers who have advised these students for the last year on this very important, personal journey, as well as to the parents who have suffered the ups and downs of the thesis writing process, to the friends and colleagues of the students themselves, who in many cases have been instrumental in helping students develop their ideas, push them forward, and then to the staff of the Watson Institute, to Anita Nestor, Sandy Suarez, Jordan Smith, who have made this event possible and have sustained us through this process. So again, thank you for being here. Really excited to hear these presentations. And without further ado, we'll begin the first panel on making foreign policy. So would Eric Brown, Leo McHone, Geraldine Messerly, and Olin Kells please come up. Susan Moffett will moderate this panel.
Hi folks, welcome. Just wanted to say a few words before we dive into our first panel. I am Professor Susan Moffett, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Director of Academic Programs here at the Watson Institute, and the undergraduate concentration falls within those academic programs. It is also my pleasure to be moderating our first panel on foreign policy. As Tony just mentioned, at this thesis conference, we have both the international and public affairs concentration, as well as international relations and public policy. And foreign policy is a topic that cuts across all of those concentrations, and it really cuts across even the 3 tracks of IAPA. So in ways, it's a fitting way to start our thesis conference, really our thesis celebration today. To reiterate, we'll be going through each of the presentations first for about 12 minutes, and then take questions at the end. You have the program, but I wanted to mention the names and the titles again because these are such special pieces of work. We'll be going in the order of the program. We'll be starting with Leo McMahon, and the thesis on freedom is Not One with Flowers, an operational analysis of the U.S. occupations of Cuba, 1906, Haiti, 1915, and Nicaragua, 1927. We'll then move on to Geraldine Maselli's thesis, Unintended Audiences of Intra-Alliance Signaling, followed by Eric Brown's thesis, True to Their Roots or a New Shade of Green, the evolution of the German Green Party's position toward NATO, 1980 to 1999. And then the last thesis for this session, Olwen Kell's Why Lawfare? Understanding the Factors that Drive International Legal Coercion. So one last bit of housekeeping to our thesis presenters. I will be sitting right there with flashcards. You have 12 minutes, but at 5 minutes I'll flash the 5, and then the 2, and then the 1, and then I will grow increasingly agitated and animated, and you will very much want to stop talking at 12 minutes. So with that, Leo, please take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. First off, I would like to thank my advisors, Professor Stephen Kinzer and Tyler Jost. I would not have made it without their help, so thank you. I wanted to write about these 3 topics, the occupation of Cuba from 1906 to 1909, Haiti from 1915 to 1916, and then onward until 1934, and Sandino's rebellion in Nicaragua in 1927. First, just because I've been interested in the historical period for a long time, particularly as an example of conflicts in which guerrillas were first pioneering sort of modern insurgency techniques. There's also, however, a little bit of a puzzle here. And this is, first, that existing theory doesn't explain the outcomes of these conflicts particularly well. Based on more recent experience, we would have expected the guerrilla forces to have been much more successful in ending U.S. occupations during the period. And on the other hand, despite a large degree of continuity between U.S. Tactics and strategy across these 3 campaigns, we see quite a wide range of outcomes between them. And I think that the existing theories that we have answer my research questions, which are, right, what explains the degree to which U.S. military forces were successful at suppressing armed insurgencies in the Caribbean in the period, and conversely, why insurgent forces were generally unsuccessful until the final campaign in which they were extremely successful. And these should shed a little bit of light on the questions above relating to more general questions about how nationalist movements are able to use insurgency techniques to defeat more powerful occupiers. And here's a map, which I hope is not too confusing, of some of the previous literature on my topic. On this side, we can see that there's a set of overlapping historical literatures on the occupation of Cuba, on the Caco War in Haiti, and on Sandino's rebellion in Nicaragua. Some historians have written on a mix of them. And on the other side, we have the theoretical literature on insurgency and in counterinsurgency. And on the top, the counterinsurgency theory mostly emerged after World War II as a response to Cold War communist guerrilla movements and the West's attempt to grapple with what that meant. That was, in turn, provoked by the middle theoretical box there, protracted warfare theory, which is the set of Maoist doctrines that underlaid the most successful guerrilla campaigns of the period. However, that theoretical literature does not line up particularly with the historical record or the historical scholarship. In part, that's because the large majority of the history on these conflicts was written in the 1960s and 1970s, and since then, there has been some interest lost in really understanding what happened here as we moved into the Cold War and away from the more explicit era of American imperialism. I have a few examples of scholars who have tried to cross this line, from Keith Bickle, who tries to bring theories of counterinsurgency and military learning to understanding the history of these conflicts, Max Boot, who does a similar thing but in a more polemical fashion in support of particular current American policy goals, and also Alan McPherson, who brings a more modern understanding of resistance to these occupations. But there's still a very tenuous linkages here, and the works are of somewhat mixed quality, particularly Max Boot's. And my attempt here is to try to bring a stronger theoretical perspective that incorporates both the strategy and organization of insurgent movements as well as those of counterinsurgents. And so here's my argument. I tend to use scholar Jenna Jordan's model of organizational vulnerability to decapitation, which primarily rests on whether an insurgent armed organization is developed in the kind of bureaucratic structure that allows the easy replacement of losses of its leaders if they are killed or captured or defect to the enemy. In my three cases, all of these insurgent organizations, despite having quite large differences in their domestic political situations and in the organization of each of the armies, are generally of low bureaucratic organization. They are led by a handful of exceptionally skilled, in many cases, leaders. That being said, that leaves them vulnerable to this tree here. The first bit of which is the question of a leader's motivations and incentives. In some of these cases, particularly in Cuba, but for the most part in both Nicaragua and Haiti as well, most of the leadership proved either ideologically friendly to the American occupation and quite happy to make deals in many cases to advance their own political interests or their own personal interests, as the U.S. was easily able to reward cooperation and punish dissent. Any organization in which their leaders were persuaded to accept U.S. occupation was quickly defeated. Those which were not, which happened in Haiti and Nicaragua, move on to the next row of the diagram here. This bit is the process that has been most studied in the literature so far. I think that it is the question of whether a leader will survive a counterinsurgency attempt is something that is answered to some degree well by existing literatures on protracted warfare and on counterinsurgency. But the result of this process, I think, depends not so much in these particular cases on the wider counterinsurgency campaign, either of winning public support among the people or of killing sufficient soldiers on one side for the other to give up, but on targeting very specific individuals within these insurgent organizations. We see that in the case of Nicaragua, where Augusto Sandino, the insurgent leader, was able to survive repeated assassination attempts, he was able to keep resistance going against the United States for 6 years. In Haiti, the other case in which insurgents actually fought back against the United States, the leaders were, in general, killed very quickly and their organizations dismantled soon afterwards. So to do the research from bringing this sort of a model to the cases themselves, I did primarily archival research at the National Archives, which has really excellent material on the occupation of Cuba, and on the archives branch of Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia, which contains more records on Haiti and Nicaragua. Unfortunately, this technique did limit me a little bit because almost all of the surviving records, in particular the records in English, come from the perspective of the American occupiers. There has been some secondary literature which I have used, which brings Haitian written sources from the period, which are minimal, and also oral traditions to try to answer some of the questions about insurgent behavior during the period. But these are, to some degree, relatively limited. In addition, the case study nature of my research means that there's, I think, an opportunity to judge whether the conclusions that I draw from my research here are more widely applicable to other cases in the Caribbean and can be a source of testing the further validity of my findings. But this, I will spare you the details of each of my 3 cases for reasons of time, though I'm very happy in the Q&A to talk about either the reasons for the occupations, the course of the campaigns, the consequences in the long term of these wars. But very briefly, in Cuba, we find the insurgents defeated very early on the tree that I showed up. These organizations, particularly the Liberal Party, which led the initial insurgency, was highly organized, but not in a sort of bureaucratic structure. It was very centralized, had a few leaders at the top who realized that they could more easily achieve their political goals by working with the United States than fighting us. Therefore, when they agreed to collaborate, armed resistance disappeared almost immediately. In Haiti, a similar process happened, but Haitian politics was much more decentralized. There were both regular soldiers and irregular Kako guerrillas. And although most of the leaders decided to collaborate with the United States for similar reasons as in Cuba, there was less ability to enforce this on subordinates. As a result, there were several bands of guerrillas who fought the United States. Unfortunately for them, their leaders were generally killed within the first weeks or months of resistance, and they couldn't develop the kind of capabilities needed to drive the United States from their countries. In the final case, Nicaragua, we see a similar situation as in Cuba or Haiti, with the exception of the man pictured here, Augusto Sandino, who not only managed to lead a very small band, something about 14 men, to start his guerrilla movement, but managed to survive years of assassination attempts and counterinsurgency campaigns, and through his leadership managed to keep resistance alive. Unfortunately, very soon after the United States withdrew from Nicaragua, he was assassinated and his political movement disappeared. The result was decades of military dictatorship. So a few conclusions from these studies. First, I found that persuasion to collaborate is a highly effective tool for counterinsurgents. This was definitely the fastest way to eliminate resistance in these conflicts. Second, decapitation I found was highly effective, and there was little evidence of a martyrdom effect. And finally, I think what's most important theoretically here is the importance of studying a variety of insurgent strategies and organizations to understanding guerrilla warfare. I think it's key to move our focus away from counterinsurgents and from traditional Maoist understandings of guerrilla warfare to understanding the variety of tactics that different armed groups use to resist occupation in different circumstances. Thank you very much.
We're pleased to now welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank my advisors, Dr. Reed Pauley and Dr. Don Kassler. Without your support, this would not have been possible, and I really appreciate everything. So, my name is Gerald Maselli, and today I invite you to explore the intricate and dynamic world of alliance relationships and learn more about why states make security decisions. My senior thesis is about the effects of bilateral signaling on third-party allies' security decision-making. Basically, I'm interested in the ways that interactions between a security patron state and one of their clients affect a third-party client's perception of the credibility of that patron state. This topic is particularly interesting to me because I have seen the importance of credibility in alliance relationships firsthand. I've spent time working at the U.S. European Combatant Command and the U.S. Strategic Command, and at those organizations, relationships with our allies and partners are critically important to furthering our shared interests. Throughout my undergraduate time, I've studied coercion theory, and its applications to alliances is important to me because I'm pursuing a career in the Army where I hope to build stronger relationships with our foreign partners. Sometimes states change their relationships with each other. A state may decide to strengthen or weaken its relationship with another for a variety of reasons, or they may threaten or promise to change that relationship. They express these intentions through signaling, like public statements, diplomatic communication, troop movement, etc. In these interactions, there are unintended international audiences. Let's say we have an interaction between three parties, called the patron, client A, and client B. The patron state is the security guarantor of both client A and client B, but the relationship between the two clients may vary. If that patron sends a signal to client A that their relationship is either strengthening or weakening, is that concerning to client B? Do third-party client states view their patron's other diplomatic interactions as indicative of overall credibility? And do they use this factor when making decisions about their own security? My thesis asks, to what extent and how do intra-alliance signals indicating credibility in security pacts sent between the patron and client A affect client B's credibility perception of their own security pact with the patron? I used two case studies to explore this dynamic. The first was the United States, South Korea, and Japan in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In this case, the United States was the security guarantor of both countries, but South Korea and Japan were not part of a formal trilateral relationship. The United States weakened their relationship with South Korea by pulling out troops in the 1960s, and I found that this bilateral change actually affected Japanese security decision-making. Japan sought to hedge against potential abandonment by investing more in their internal defense capabilities and seeking to strengthen their relationship with South Korea. The archival documents I examined indicated that American signaling to South Korea played a significant role in Japanese decisions. Japan thought that South Korean security was critical to their own security, so a perception of changing American commitment to South Korea greatly concerns Japanese leaders. My next case is the United States, Germany, and the Baltic states during the Trump administration. This case revealed some additional dynamics since all countries were NATO members, so the relationship between the two client states was different than in the previous case. But it found that client B decision-making was affected by patron client A signaling, though to a lesser extent. The evidence suggests that client states within a multilateral security framework are less likely to worry about their security patrons' bilateral signaling, as long as their relationship to the collective alliance is stable. The Trump administration's contradictory signals to Germany versus NATO as a whole and the Baltic states specifically may have offset the effect of bilateral signals in the Baltic case. So in that case, the Trump administration was having a lot of bilateral weakening signals to Germany, but they were actually sending strengthening signals to NATO as a whole and to the Baltic states, which I believe was the more salient signal that affected their decision-making. There is a robust body of literature about how the targets of signals receive and interpret them, and how they affect bilateral alliance relationships. Coercion among allies and intra-alliance signaling is a well-studied topic in international relations. However, my research seeks to fill a gap and focuses on the ways that these bilateral signals affect other states' security decision-making. Except for Victor Cha's research into the concept of quasi-alliances between two clients of the same patron, there is relatively little literature about the unintended audiences of bilateral signaling. This thesis synthesizes ideas in political psychology, coercion theory, and theories on alliance dynamics to analyze this understudied facet of security relationships. Methodologically, I used mostly qualitative coding of primary source documents from the foreign relations of the US archives or the press. This thesis studies perception, which can only be analyzed and predicted based on evidence, never fully known. However, the use of primary source documents allowed me to make informed decisions about the extent to which intra-alliance signaling was playing a role in client B decision-making. In the US-Germany-Baltics case, heavy use of newspaper sources may have biased the findings towards what heads of state wanted to publicly project about their relationships with their allies. This has interesting implications for potential contrast between public projections of a relationship versus internal perceptions. The US-South Korea case mostly analyzed diplomatic communications among the three countries in American and Japanese online archives. In both cases, I found that the central factor determining whether or not client states viewed the signals through the lenses of their own security was a fear of abandonment. Client B states with a high threat perception and a high dependency on the patron were more likely to interpret the signals as indicative of patron credibility pertaining to their own relationship. Overall, this research suggests that third-party clients are keenly aware of the signals that the patron state sends to other clients when those signals trigger a fear of abandonment. On the case level, this research analyzes moments in American reevaluation of alliance strategy through a new lens. The thesis suggests that commitment to multilateral alliances could offset the effect of bilateral signaling. Client B states seem to emphasize whatever signals are most salient to them. If fears of abandonment are offset by other signals from the patron, this can alleviate patron-client A signaling. The US, South Korea, and Japan case suggests that when clients feel a threat of abandonment, they may seek to strengthen their own bilateral relationships as a form of hedging. These findings are conceptually significant because they show that the patron-client A bilateral signaling is an overlooked factor when assessing client B decision-making. The evidence showed that these signals are not the sole factor in client B security behavior, but they are significant and must be assessed when analyzing alliance dynamics. Existing literature focuses on the perceptions of the client A state or the perceptions of the adversary, but rarely on the client B state. This research addresses a critical gap in our understanding of these alliance relationships. Practically, this has implications for American foreign policy regarding our alliances. The United States strategy of leading through our relationships requires us to conduct evaluations into the unintended effects of our diplomacy. Also, the findings suggest that the United States should support more multilateral security frameworks around the world to help reduce client dependency and fear of abandonment, and enable greater interoperability among allies. The question of client B perceptions of intra-alliance signaling between the patron and client A will remain relevant, particularly as the United States seeks to continue competing with Russia and China for global influence. This research not only advances our understanding of alliance dynamics, but has critical implications for decision makers and scholars tasked with navigating the complex terrain of international relations in the modern day.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all so much for coming today, and congratulations to everyone in this room who wrote a thesis and is presenting today or tomorrow. We were told this is a celebration, so it's a pleasure to celebrate with all of you this accomplishment. My name is Eric Brown, and my thesis is titled True to Their Roots, or A New Shade of Green, the Evolution of the German Green Party's Position Toward NATO from 1980 to 1999, and I'm specifically investigating the policy shift of the German Green Party from being staunchly opposed to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at the party's establishment in 1980 to really strongly supporting the alliance beginning in the late 1990s and continuing to the present day, and how this policy shift impacts the broader foreign and security policy positions of the German Greens currently. Before I get into the presentation, I would like to say a couple of words of thanks. Thank you so much to my primary thesis advisor, Professor Nick Ziegler, and my second reader, Professor Mark Blythe, for their countless comments and feedback over more than a year now. This end product would not look anywhere near what it does today if it weren't for your help, so thank you so much for that. Thank you also to Tony Levitas for leading our honors seminar in the fall, and for also listening to my constantly evolving ideas in the spring as I was writing chapters. The idea for this thesis was born out of my study abroad semester in Berlin in spring 2022, during which I was really able to witness and observe firsthand the immediate reactions of the German government to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many observers of German foreign and security policy were quick to note that the positions taken by the current governing coalition in Berlin were a sharp departure from traditionally held German foreign security policy positions, most notably the willingness to send military assistance, aid, and other military elements to Ukraine to active conflict zones. But the group that I was and continue to be most interested with is the German Green Party, not least because of their founding in the early 1980s as a very staunchly anti-NATO, anti-military party. And so the question and puzzle of how this party that was so strongly opposed to NATO, that demanded that West Germany exit the alliance, that demanded the alliance's dissolution, would then at some point in the next 20 years have a party conference in which they change this position, and then in 2022 become one of the strongest, if not the strongest, supporter of NATO within the German political system, and what's more, most strongly support out of all German parties the delivery of heavy weapons to Ukraine. So this puzzle boils down to the basic question of why did the German Green Party alter its founding opposition to NATO in the late 1990s? After an initial sort of survey of the literature and interviewing various individuals, the argument boils down to two explanatory factors as to why this position changed. First and foremost, at the same time that this position changed, the German Greens also joined their first coalition at the federal level with the Social Democrats, and a minority faction within the German Green Party, as early as the 1980s, wished to change this position toward NATO in order to be a viable coalition partner and to be able to join a coalition with the Social Democrats, who also in the 1980s had signaled to the Greens that the only way in which they would join a coalition at the federal level is if they changed this position. But again, this was a minority faction within the Greens that were swayed by this factor, and therefore something else was needed to really push the party over the edge. And this is where the historical context really matters, because at the same time, in the late 1990s, the outbreak of the Kosovo War and the failure of civilian organizations such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the UN, to prevent violent outbreaks and atrocities in Kosovo ultimately caused the Greens to then shift this position to realize that NATO was necessary to restore peace in Europe and ultimately cause the change in their position toward the alliance. In designing my research project, this is a case study of the German Green Party. I selected the case based off of its peculiarity and also out of personal interest. I thought that the staunch opposition toward NATO of the Greens really contrasted quite greatly with the ultimate support for the alliance beginning in the late 90s. And I also wanted to understand really the full process from the party's founding in 1980 because of its ties with the German peace movement and its anti-NATO position then to its change in the late 90s, which is why I selected the time frame of 1980 to 1999. In terms of methodology, I used historical method, really using process tracing to try to understand the causal mechanisms in this shift in position. I traveled to Berlin to the Green Party archives, the Archives of Green Thought, to find as many primary source documents as possible, and also conducted interviews at an elite level with former members of the German Green Party, most notably Ludger Vollmer, who was the state secretary in the German Federal Foreign Office in 1998, and who also helped draft the foreign and security policy positions of the coalition agreement with the SPD, and also Antje Radke, who was a co-party chair of the German Green Party in 1998 at the time of this shift. In terms of placing this thesis within broader theoretical literature, I went to theories of party change, that is, authors who have sought to answer the question, why do political parties change their positions? Because ultimately this is a case of such a question. Happy in the Q&A to go over why these explanations on the left are insufficient in explaining why the Greens changed this position, but suffice to say the through line for each of these three factors is that, one, they treat parties as uniform, unitary actors that is made up of individuals and groups that have the same positions, desires, motivations for having a particular position, and also they're all monocausal, that is, they note that parties change positions because of one specific reason. However, my argument notes that there were multiple factors that caused the Greens to ultimately shift this position that were important for various factions within the party, and therefore I labeled these all insufficient and truly offering an answer to my research question. And therefore, I prefer models that treat parties as networks of various factions or groupings, that is, with competing motivations that are shaped by external events and shocks, and ultimately when they coalesce or when they join forces to make majority factions, do parties adopt particular positions. And another subset of this literature that notes that dominant faction change within parties can ultimately lead to a position change, which was the case with the German Greens and NATO. I would love to go from 1980 to 1999 and really explain the evolution of this position. However, time simply does not allow for that. But I did identify throughout the 1980s and 1990s 3 relevant intra-party factions within the German Green Party that were ultimately decisive in shaping this position toward NATO. The first of which, the radical pacifists, as the name suggests, were the most staunchly anti-military, anti-use of force, and most importantly, anti-NATO of the German Greens. Beginning in the 1980s, they were demanding that the alliance be dissolved, that West Germany and then a reunified Germany after 1990 exit the alliance. However, they were a minority faction within the party and ultimately had to align with the second group, the political pacifists, to get their positions through in party documents in the 1980s. Opposite the radical pacifists was a group dubbed the Realos, the Realists, most notably led by Joschka Fischer, who was the Green foreign minister, or the German foreign minister in 1998 of the Green Party. The Realos saw use in NATO. They believed that NATO was necessary in the 1980s to prevent the resurgence of a nationalistic, militaristic Germany, and then also in the 1990s used historical justification in promoting the idea that NATO should intervene first in Bosnia, but then also in Kosovo in the 90s. So the pro-NATO group. They were also a minority faction up until the ultimate shift in position in the late 90s, which leaves the political pacifists, this group in the middle between the radical pacifists and the Realos, who were the dominant faction from 1980 really until 1998. This is a group that before reunification emphasized an idea of unilateral disarmament and believed that the exit from NATO, Germany's exit from NATO, would be one step of this unilateral disarmament process. And then after reunification in 1990 really focused on the idea of replacing military institutions such as NATO with civilian counterparts like the OSCE, like the UN, so on and so forth. And really, this anti-NATO line was dominant until the late 1990s, and it was the ultimate failure of civilian organizations like the UN, like the OSCE, which at that point had a mandate in Kosovo to prevent atrocities and genocide that led to this dominant faction change within the party. This study has a number of implications both on a theoretical and practical level, and I've listed them here. The shortcomings of treating parties as unitary actors in scholarly literature, as well as theories that identify one factor for party change, while clearly there are instances in which parties are much more aligned with each other, or members of parties are much more aligned with each other, or there are instances in which one factor causes a party to change its position. This thesis doesn't discount those. It just simply highlights that there are instances in which these theories do not paint a full picture. Secondly, this thesis offers empirical evidence for theories of dominant faction change being responsible for parties changing their policy positions. That is one of the major shortcomings of this subset of literature on dominant faction change, is that it lacks empirical evidence, and so this thesis helps build up the case that this can cause party change. And finally, it bridges an important gap between theory and historical explanations. As I noted, the preferred theoretical frameworks for this thesis are ones that identify parties as made up of various factions and groupings that then respond to external shocks and events and ultimately change their positions based off of those. What they don't account for is what these specific external shocks and historical factors are. That's where historical context matters, and I try to offer both within this thesis. On a practical level, first, this thesis offers an understanding of the shift in the German Green Party's concept of peace, Frieden in German, and how to achieve it. Particularly in the 1980s, there was a phrase that kept being used in German Green Party documents: there can be no peace with NATO. That was repeated over and over again. In 1998, when the Greens for the first time in a party program expressed support for NATO, they list that NATO is an indispensable instrument for peace in Europe. And so this interesting transition in how the Greens quantify peace and how they believe it can be achieved either first against NATO and now with NATO, that's an important shift, and it first emerges in the late 90s in the time frame of this thesis. Second, the role of history in shaping German and Green foreign policy. There are countless instances in which Germany's history, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, has shaped its decisions that it makes today, most notably in the war in Ukraine. But particularly in the Realo faction in the German Green Party, one can see the role of history and how they understood NATO and how they promoted it as being a force for good. Firstly, in the mid-'80s, when once again they said NATO was necessary to prevent a resurgent Germany, a militaristic Germany, by delegating Germany's military structures to a supranational organization. They were preventing even the possibility of Germany to emerge once again as a military power in Europe. And then secondly, the role of the Wehrmacht in former Yugoslavia during World War II was a very big reason as to why many prominent Greens, Joschka Fischer included, used phrases such as never again war, never again Auschwitz, in promoting the idea that NATO intervention was necessary to prevent atrocities in Kosovo. And finally, this thesis offers a case of comparison for other European Green parties vis-a-vis their position toward NATO. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the German Greens were very unique in that they were one of the only Green parties throughout Europe that supported NATO. Now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Green Party in Finland has changed its position in support of NATO, and most notably in March, or most recently in March, the UK Green Party as well has shifted its position on NATO, now supporting the alliance. And while there wasn't time in this thesis to really look at this through a comparative lens, the case of the German Greens and offering a robust explanation for why they changed this position toward NATO offers now a counterpoint for these more newly transition parties in terms of their position toward the Atlantic Alliance. So that's that. I would like to end this presentation the same way that I ended my thesis, with a bit of a historical parallel, because I do think it's quite fitting. In 1998, Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic assumed that a newly formed German government, with the German Greens as a member of this government, would not endorse a NATO military campaign in Yugoslavia and ultimately cause alliance disunity. He was wrong. In 2022, intelligence reports have indicated that Vladimir Putin, in conducting the calculus as to whether or not to invade Ukraine, believed that the newly formed German government, again with the German Greens as a key member, would be a source of Western disunity in responding to Russia's invasion. Putin, too, was wrong. In both instances, and to go back to the title of my thesis, I do believe the German Greens have remained true to their roots of promoting long-term peace and stability on the European continent, while exhibiting new shades of green, or new means by which to achieve these goals. One can only hope that violence will not break out in Europe again, but if it does, I would not make the mistake of betting against the German Greens. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Olwen Kells and I will be speaking today on my thesis, the title of which is Why Lawfare, Understanding the Factors That Drive International Legal Coercion. So to start, there's a few terms that I would like to define, the first of which is lawfare. I'm going to assume that many of you haven't heard it. It's kind of a niche thing within the field of international law. Lawfare is when a state uses international law to coerce another state into doing its bidding. So this looks like when a state will go to the International Court of Justice, right, the main arbitrator for international disputes, file a claim, and as a result of the claim, the state does something that the suing state wanted them to do. Most of the time, this occurs in parallel to war. Coercion is another pretty big term I talk about in my thesis, and that is the use or threat of force to make a state do your bidding. So legal coercion being using the ICJ to coerce. And international law, believe it or not, it's actually a pretty controversial term. The main definition that people like to cite is that I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. But for the purposes of this thesis, international law is just the body of rules and norms that govern state interactions on the international scale. So lawfare has become an increasingly common phenomenon in the last 20 years. It's actually not very common to see many conflicts that don't have a legal parallel to them. For example, if we think about modern-day Ukraine, not only is there a International Court of Justice case in relation to the conflicts with Russia, but there's also an International Criminal Court case where Putin and one of his associates are being sued for mass deportation of mainly orphans and young kids. Nevertheless, many of these cases involve smaller states suing larger states or superpowers when these superpowers violate international law or violate the rights of the smaller state. So my case study was Nicaragua, pretty small, pretty weak state, especially after the socialist revolution in the late 1970s. And the United States violated its sovereignty by doing many things, including mining Nicaragua's main port and causing millions of dollars in destruction of foreign vessels. So the main puzzle behind lawfare is that, it all makes sense, law, coercion, but International Court of Justice rulings aren't binding on states that haven't accepted the court's jurisdiction. As a compromise for having such a big system in place for monitoring state affairs, states can opt in to having the court look at their case, examine it, and then make a ruling. And both states are supposed to agree that they'll implement whatever the finding is. However, if you think about the United States in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, the U.S. kind of just did whatever it wanted, and that included ignoring International Court of Justice rulings. So just to go through, we start with the big research puzzle, why states are even doing this to begin with. But my thesis specifically looks at what factors influence the decision for the state to pursue this very niche form of coercion. So if we look to the right, we have the Contras, the counterinsurgents, or the insurgents to the Sandino government. And how do we get from fighting with them in the foothills to suing the United States and the International Court of Justice? What exactly happened there to influence this? So the significance of my thesis is that I challenge these main theories of lawfare that currently exist. So most of the scholarship can be broken down to three categories. We have the scholarship that believes that lawfare is just what Eastern states, the other states, use to combat Western powers when they're trying to do peaceful interventions or other sorts of mediation or meddling in other states' affairs. The middle group actually doesn't believe that lawfare is an international phenomenon at all. They ascribe it to a domestic phenomenon, vis-a-vis sort of abusing the very weak judicial system in a certain country in order to advance business prospects or something like that. And the last one cites lawfare as the abuse of international law to coerce another state into doing your bidding. So I think that the first and the third theories, they do have credence because most cases of lawfare involve an Eastern state suing a Western state or a smaller state, weaker state, suing a bigger state. And there is a use of law to coerce. But the issue I take with these theories is that they don't look at why states are pursuing lawfare to begin with. They just kind of say, it is what it is, this is what's happening. So if we look at the what's missing section that I have over here, we know that conflict begins and a state chooses a response to the conflict. The insurgents started in Nicaragua, the government had to choose a response to it. Initially, and throughout the entire conflict itself, Nicaragua was fighting with these forces. However, it's not entirely clear how and why they decided in 1984 specifically to then sue the United States. So I spend the majority of my thesis addressing this question. So the method that I use to address the question is process tracing. So I identified these factors of the conflict, which include things like economic power, religious systems, kinship systems, trade relations, alliances, colonial relations as well. And I wanted to see which group of these factors, if we look all the way back into when Nicaragua first started its occupation by the U.S. to 1984, so basically 1900 to 1984, what stayed the same, what influences were there, what's kind of happening, what are these sorts of historical anthropological sources of lawfare that are sources of these factors that we could look at and see if they still kind of persist within the legal doctrine of the case itself. So I first identified the main factors, which I'm going to kind of jump to the end. Main factors are trade relations, colonialism, of course, and alliances. So I evaluated the existence of these things all the way back in the first kind of fledglings of the revolution, and then looked at them in 1984. I found that these kind of stayed the most consistent, or were the most present, or most influential within Nicaragua's decision-making process. So then I decided, all right, now that I've identified these, let's look at the thousands of pages that is the ICJ case and see what Nicaragua makes its argument from. Like, does it make an argument based on colonialism? Does it make an economic argument? Does it simply say, the United States wronged us, here's all the evidence, you need to tell them to stop? I found that, in fact, they did make quite a few arguments based on colonialism. The narrative that Nicaragua portrayed was that Nicaragua was basically abused by the United States for about 80 years. And if you look at US history, Nicaragua was the single most invaded country by the United States, which it's kind of hard to think with, the prevalence of like the Iraqi wars and stuff like that. But it's Nicaragua in terms of separate interventions. And I thought that it was quite interesting that at this moment, Nicaragua had decided, you know what, we're done with the fighting. We're instead going to sue the United States. So the first conclusion that I drew was that states use lawfare to enact a hypocrisy cost on the state that they're suing. Because remember, these cases are non-binding, especially on the United States. You could just kind of choose to ignore them. China did that with the South China Sea case. Just ignored what the ICJ said. No one could really do anything about it because the alternative is really going to war using another form of coercion. So when Nicaragua sued the United States, they were looking to enact sort of a hypocrisy cost to not only validate their struggle against the United States intervention, but also to show the world, hey, the United States has agreed to using these sets of norms, they're violating them. Look at us, we've been invaded for many years, we've been subject to colonialism, our economy's in shambles, our alliances are all over the place, and this is all because we're fighting a civil war at the same time we're trying to build a government. So as we move to influential factors, as I say before, state ideologies, colonial history, and in particular being a simple case. If you look at the case itself, it's remarkably straightforward. Like, there were all these secret CIA interventions and sets to mine this area and blow up this building and blow up that building. But they're not so secret when President Reagan makes them really public in presidential addresses. So more or less everyone knew what the United States was doing and that it was wrong. But Nicaragua was the only state that said, hey, something wrong is going on here. And state ideologies, of course, play a big factor into it. Nicaragua at this time, socialist, and the United States, of course, quite capitalist. So that difference in ideology, or that ideological struggle, is also validated when you sue a state in the International Court of Justice. An interesting note about colonial history is that I kind of lumped all these economic trade relation factors that Nicaragua cited as being troubled by the United States within the court case. However, in other situations where there isn't such a clear-cut colonial dynamic, I believe that actually economic and trade relations and regional alliances can still play a pretty big factor, even when they're not kind of encapsulated in this unilateral colonial relation. And finally, I believe that these factors encourage a state to pursue international arbitration to legitimize their struggle. When there isn't necessarily a kind of protracted, long-standing ideological hatred, if you will, between two countries. Like the Sandinistas, their entire ideology was built on anti-imperialism, anti-United States. And you can't ignore that that's definitely a factor in wanting to validate your struggles on the world stage. So, major ideas. Contributions is that I introduced this novel analytical framework, which no other scholarship has done before at this time. And I look at these historical factors to see what caused this to happen. I don't just assume the state is using its rights to sue another state in the ICJ. I try to make no assumptions except looking at these certain specific factors that kind of drive the argumentation. I also believe that lawfare is a response, not necessarily an abuse of international law, mainly because the states that are suing because their rights have been violated. They do have a legitimate claim. And with regards to current scholarship, the big takeaway is that if we look at cases that are happening now or have happened using this factor-oriented framework, it becomes pretty clear why exactly these states are pursuing this form of warfare over more traditional forms of, bombs and hacking and sanctions and other such things. I also believe that the current literature, with not only taking these into account, uses more of like a Western-centric approach. And when you remove that sort of approach and you look at the case for what it is, you tend to lose some of those biases that may cause someone to believe that it's a sort of Western versus Eastern state dynamic. And that is everything. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah.
Thank you, each of you. And let's take some questions from the audience. The first is Professor Lewis.
I just want to say thank you all for your really amazing presentations, most of which I don't feel equipped to comment on. But, you know, congratulations, and this was really fascinating. The comment I have is for Alwyn. And I noticed that you didn't take the broader international context, what was happening around the time that Nicaragua presented its case. And I'm just wondering if that would add something to your analysis. And I'm saying this because I don't think that you can think about Nicaragua without thinking about the context in which the Nicaraguan Revolution happened. In 1979, you had three important revolutionary events happening. You had the Iranian Revolution, you had the Grenadian Revolution, and you had the Nicaraguan Revolution. So I think that if you're thinking about the US response, then you have to think about what's happening, not just in Nicaragua, but the feeling that there was like a rash of these events that were threatening US hegemony. The second thing is that what happened in 1983, I think, is significant in understanding Nicaragua's response, because the US invaded Grenada and it ended before, we won't go into that. But the US invasion of Grenada, I think, may have signaled to Nicaragua that the US is now, under the Reagan administration, willing to break international law. And if you look at the UN response, the majority of countries in the world rejected any claims that the US had for legitimately invading a sovereign country. So I think that in that context, moral suasion is very important in international law. And Nicaragua going to have a legal case against the US, I think is amplifying the lack of morality that the US had and legality. So I just think that there's a broader story going on there that I think might add to what you're saying. Thanks.
So these aren't like push.
I think
Are
if you
they?
see the green line, you're good to go.
Okay, cool. Hi, well, thank you so much for your question, Professor. So I do definitely delve more into the context within the thesis. In total, between looking at the historical context of it and the actual case itself is about 70 pages worth. So that definitely did make up part of my analysis, even though I wasn't able to touch on it today. I would say that the most interesting piece of evidence in response to your question is that the chief prosecutor the chief legal representative for Nicaragua actually cited the U.S.'s case in the ICJ against Iran in 1979 as one of the more influential factors for deciding to sue, because if the United States can sue Iran, why can't we sue the United States? So the context within the time, especially with some of the statements that President Reagan made about not supporting any of these new revolutions in Latin America at the time, definitely plays a huge factor within Nicaragua's decision. I think the temporal context is definitely important when considering why a state is going to use lawfare just as much as a historical context. Does that answer your question,
yeah,
or is there
absolutely.
another? Okay, great.
But I still think that you should think, I mean, of course you're not writing, but just think about how Grenada, how important that was as the first open open American invasion since Vietnam. It's
you.
very significant in that context.
Other questions? Professor Bassett.
Hi, thank you. These were great, and I really appreciate the use of case studies to illustrate the theories. Each one of you did that in a really terrific way. My question is for Leo around ideology and willingness to collaborate. And I'm wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into the idea of when leaders are willing to work with their oppressor, essentially, instead of continuing an insurgency, and what we can draw from that into potentially other cases of insurgency.
Sure, yeah. This is, I think, one of the parts of my thesis that I certainly found most interesting looking at. I think we don't necessarily, or at least I don't necessarily have an excellent explanation for why these particular leaders came to their particular ideologies. A lot of them share similar backgrounds and have very different ideological responses. But I think that the choice that they're presented with at the outset of the invasion means that almost anyone who doesn't have incredibly strong anti-imperialist ideology, when faced with the choice in all of these conflicts, where essentially they can cooperate with the United States and gain, I think there's a tendency in a lot of American historiography to accuse collaborators of corruption, of not being interested in the welfare of their countries. And I don't think that's necessarily true. But if their political goals are, say, development or stability, that the choice presented between collaborating with the United States and winning the support of a great power for those, and the alternative choice of taking up arms against a military which had defeated insurgencies across the Caribbean earlier, and in the Philippines and in the American West, means that it's an almost suicidal option. And each of the guerrilla leaders that I was able to look into their personal correspondence from the outset thought that they would die, and thought that they would lose in many cases. But only the understanding that American occupation was completely incompatible with their political goals under any circumstances, and a willingness to take the moral stance that compromised any sort of personal interest they had, was the only thing that was sufficient to keep insurgents in this particular case willing to lead continued armed uprisings.
Yes. Professor Polly.
Thank you. This is a terrific panel presentations. Congratulations, everybody. I had the pleasure of working with Geraldine and Olwen, and you've heard enough from me this term, so my questions are for the other two. Leo, for you, you made a statement at one point that you looked into kind of the aftermath effect and did not observe martyrdom, right? That there wasn't this idea that, I guess the aphorism is that you can kill the person, but you can't kill the idea. So I want to hear more about why that's not the case, right? What is it that fails to live on after the political assassination, in your cases in particular? And for you, Eric, fantastic investigation of the German Green Party. I just want to hear more about it in the current moment about support for Ukraine. We have this vision every day in the paper now that Western aid has been provided to the Ukrainian military, and they're going to use it to great advantage in the spring offensive that is upcoming, if not started already. My question is, what happens if that goes badly for this year or for another fighting season or 2 or 3 years, right? Is your sense that this is resilient support, not just support for NATO, but I'm talking about particularly the newfound German enthusiasm for providing support for an ongoing war? How resilient will that be to what is almost inevitably in a conflict, a very rocky path, if there is a path at all, to something resembling victory? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I probably could have been a little more precise when I say that I didn't find any martyrdom effect. I do certainly find in several of the cases that there is a significant influence on politics afterwards. I mean, Sandino's assassination after the end of the rebellion has a legacy that, I mean, we saw reverberating in Owen's case. And in Haiti, although I don't write a chapter on the second Caco War, which followed the period that I write about, but the guerrilla leader Charlemagne Peralta, who was assassinated by Marines, and there's a famous picture of him which formed the basis for the illustration that I showed in my presentation. He became a martyr and is still a national hero in Haiti. And these assassinations definitely caused moral outrage in the countries involved, but I find that they didn't translate into effective resistance, because the reason that these leaders were able to be martyrs is that they were such effective leaders of insurgent groups, and because of a lack of bureaucratic organization here, the organization that they led found it very difficult to replace their unique interpersonal and political skills. So there was certainly resistance afterwards, but it simply wasn't coordinated enough to win.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the question as well. Happy to comment on any sort of German foreign policy. It is an interesting question, but I think what's been particularly fascinating in the case of the German Greens is just how much they feel as if they should be supporting Ukraine in this war, even compared to their more conservative counterparts that might be historically more likely to support weapons packages, to support military aid to Ukraine. Of course, you have the tension between sending military aid to a foreign country and domestic concerns. Obviously, in the case of Germany, that was energy prices over the winter. But in the case of the German Greens, I mean, if there's one thing that the Greens were more opposed to at their founding than NATO, it was nuclear energy. And throughout this winter, even over 50% of German Greens were willing to extend the life of nuclear reactors in Germany because they so strongly supported the measures that Germany was taking to reduce its dependencies on Russia and to support Ukraine. And then also in other opinion polls, I don't have the exact numbers, but in finding numbers for support for weapons deliveries, it was also the Greens that were most strongly in support of Germany's current course in militarily supporting Ukraine in their defense against Russia. So in that sense, I think the Greens have been fascinating to look at how they've sort of adapted to their domestic audience in still supporting Ukraine, and I think their supporters are strongly believe ideologically that they should be doing this. So what they're doing in supporting weapons to Ukraine is the correct thing to do. There have been interviews with Green Party leaders since the war broke out that have said, we've never been a pacifist party. We believe we should be supporting groups that are defending themselves, and they definitely see Ukraine as one of these groups. In terms of resilience, if the counteroffensive doesn't work out, I would say, at least right now, I'm optimistic, just in the sense Zelensky was in Berlin either yesterday or the day before, marking 444 days after the invasion. Germany just announced its largest military aid package to date. As Zelensky came to Berlin, they gave him a prize in Aachen. I mean, the list goes on in terms of support for Ukraine in this current moment, even though it's been over a year since the war broke out, that energy prices have gone up. So in that sense, right now it's resilient. Of course, one can only speculate how that will be impacted by successes or failures on the battlefield, but I'd say that Zeitenwende is real, regardless of whether or not it's slow or whether or not people want to see more. But I guess I'm optimistic because of those recent developments.
Professor Ziegler.
Thanks to all the panelists. I too thought these were terrific presentations. I very much enjoyed working with Eric Brown, and I do have a short question for Eric, but also for Geraldine Masselli. Toward the end of your presentation on your implications, one of them was that strengthening multilateral organizations would be a good way of attenuating the suspicions caused by one client, say country B, by a diminution in or negative signaling to client state A. And that makes perfect sense to me, but I wondered how in practice it would work out in the second of your two cases, which involved NATO. And if it involved, if the strengthening occurred within the European Union or an independent European military capability rather than within NATO. In other words, within a separate multilateral institution that did not include the patron state itself, as NATO of course does. Do you think the effect would be different? And very quickly for Eric Brown, just building on Professor Pauly's question, do you think the Greens today are attracting younger voters? Aren't they beginning to look, as they change their positions, in a way more and more like the Democratic Party of the United States, sort of progressive on economic issues, individual rights oriented, a space that was not occupied previously in the German political spectrum? And is that going to appeal to younger Germans, or are they just going to continue to want something different and decide that the Greens are basically, you know, a bunch of 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds who are kind of just, you know, going in with the way things have always been done for the last 70 years? Thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you for your question, Professor. That's a very interesting question. So I think the NATO case in my research was really what led me to that implication, because I saw the kind of drastic differences between how the Baltic states, as the client B actor in that situation, or actors. It was important that in my thesis I go into the different differences between the Baltic states, because obviously that's not a homogenous organization. Like, those are three separate countries with different priorities, and they all reacted slightly differently, but with trends. And I think that we were able to see, so the Trump administration was weakening their relationship with Germany, but they were actually doing a lot to signal their growing commitment to the Baltic states at that time. So Trump was making repeated statements about how the United States was supporting NATO, and obviously some of this was contradicted by his other statements about how NATO countries needed to pay more or else the United States would consider withdrawing and things like that. But that was a lot more targeted at Germany specifically. And over again they repeated that the American commitment to NATO was relatively strong. And regardless of the rhetoric, the American actions during the Trump administration did display strong commitment to NATO. So they decided to pursue new battle groups in NATO, which the United States was a part of, and those were based in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So that showed like strong commitment to the Baltic states. So I found that the Baltic leaders, for the most part, projected confidence about their relationship with the United States, despite everything that was going on with Germany. So it kind of showed that they were very aware of what was going on with Germany, but were not so much affected by it. Versus in the US, South Korea, Japan case, Japanese decision makers were very nervous about what was going on with South Korea. And it led them to pursue this bilateral relationship with South Korea to kind of hedge against like potential American abandonment. And I think that kind of implies that states that feel more secure about their security framework in general and have less bilateral dependency on the patron state, even if that is the primary security patron, will be less likely to have that high dependency. And in my theoretical model, I note that the high dependency and high threat perception are the two factors that go into a state having a large fear of abandonment, which was the primary variable for how much they'd be affected by that patron-client asignaling. And then regarding the second part of your question about implications of like strengthening an independent or like a separate organization in Europe, I think that is a very interesting idea. I think the United States should focus on NATO, since it shows its credibility in that organization as it's a part of. But I don't see harm within my theoretical framework. I think that U.S. support to an independent European security organization would reduce client dependency. So it would probably reduce the fear of abandonment, which would cause less concern over patron signaling. So I think overall, I'd have to research more into that, but I don't see immediate negative effects of that. I think that would advance U.S. interests.
Thank you.
Well, thank you as well for the question. I wish I had demographic data because obviously that probably would give a more straightforward answer, but I can think of a few factors that might impact the Greens and their appeal to younger audiences within the German electorate. Of course, it's interesting because the Greens at their founding were a young party. They were made up of a lot of student activists who were involved in the '68 movement. They just typically were younger than their more established counterparts. And now those same founding individuals, like you mentioned, are the 50 and 60-year-olds. And so it's the question of, can they attract a more young audience? It's interesting, too. The Greens just recently lost votes in an election in Bremen. I don't know what the demographic breakdown of that is, but clearly they still have some work to do in terms of appealing to a wider audience, which I guess has always been the problem for the Green Party coming in and out of the Bundestag in their existence. I think maybe an important factor is at the time of their founding, the Greens were, I guess, the most progressive party in the German political system, or at least the most far left party within the German party spectrum. But since then, obviously, the left party, Die Linke, has come into existence and has constantly cleared the 5% voting threshold in various state-level parliaments, and then also at the federal level. And then you also, alternatively, not to say that many Green voters are going this direction, but you do have the AfD, and there might be issues in which sort of this more far-right party in the German parliament could co-opt some of these younger voters depending on their specific positions, anti-establishment perhaps, positions that you might have expected from the Greens a few decades ago. I think young voters are obviously focusing on issues like climate change, and by name, the Greens technically are the climate party within Germany. Yet at the same time, in a political system like Germany's, most parties are concerned with climate change. You don't really have the issue like in the United States, where it seems like the Democrats really own the issue, whereas the Republicans might be climate skeptical or even deniers of climate change. So I feel as if the Greens are able to sort of continue to really own this issue and offer solutions toward climate change that are appealing to a younger audience, obviously by nature of having led on this issue for so long, that's a benefit, but they still have to be able to differentiate themselves from the other parties that are also offering their own solutions on issues that matter to younger voters. I guess finally I would say, and this is just a bit of speculation, I would probably younger voters are more adaptable or more flexible in their response to certain issues. I don't know exactly if younger voters are more in support of like aiding Ukraine, or if younger voters really believe that they should like stand strong in supporting Ukraine compared to perhaps older voters who wish to see their energy costs go down. I don't know, the list goes on, but I think if younger voters are more driven by ideological sort of factors, then the Greens typically up to this point have really also been a party that can sway based on ideological concerns. And so in that sense, they might be able to appeal to a younger audience or be a bit more flexible than their more established counterparts who really don't change positions on fundamental issues that often. So those are just some thoughts, but yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Professor Ingham.
Well, first of all, again, thank you so much for really very interesting and fascinating presentations, and congratulations on finishing your thesis projects. I have a process question. As an advisor to some of the students here at Watson, we often find students in their sophomore, junior year trying to figure out how to identify a thesis project, a thesis topic. And I'm curious about how you went about your process. This is a question for all of you. In Eric's case, specifically, once you answer your question, I'd like to hear how the combination of your study abroad and the selection of the thesis topic worked for you. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I, in junior year or whatever, went to the thesis workshop held by Professor Elliott. I wanted to do a kind of substantial research process to prepare me better for graduate school. As to the choice of topic, it came just because this was a historical period that I had been interested in for a while. I'd taken Professor Kinzer's class on American interventions, and that had sort of sparked my interest in the Caribbean insurgencies. And so, combination of topic I was interested in and couldn't find exactly what I wanted to read on it, and wanting to do a kind of historical research project led me to that point.
So kind of similarly, I wanted to pursue a kind of large-scale research project, both like to challenge myself academically and like to prepare myself better for graduate school down the line. With regards to the specific topic, kind of like I talked about in my presentation, I've spent some time actually like on the ground working in organizations that focus on alliance relationships. So the U.S. European Command is very focused on our relationships in Europe and diplomacy there. And then U.S. Strategic Command as well. Like our alliance networks really underpin American credibility in deterrence. So I have a professional interest in that as well, like going into the military, because a lot of what we do in the military is very focused on building relationships with other countries. Even all the way down to the tactical level, like as an infantry lieutenant, I could very well be working with our allies and partners in Poland and other parts of the world, building those relationships on the individual level. So I knew that I wanted to do something about alliances, and I wanted to do something about credibility as well. I had taken Dr. Pauly's class, Coercion, Deterrence, and Compellence, and that was probably the most influential academic class that I've had here as far as like setting the theoretical underpinnings of my research. So I was able to kind of combine that professional interest and that academic interest into a project that I've really enjoyed working on.
Yeah, I would say I had a similar approach to Geraldine in the sense that I really knew I had a broad idea of what I wanted to write a thesis on, being Germany, but I wasn't exactly sure what the specific question would be within that, and therefore, I guess in a certain sense, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but it felt like the project almost came to me in the sense that when I was in Germany during the study abroad semester, this puzzling question of why were the German Greens so strongly in support of NATO, given their history, I couldn't find an adequate answer to that. And so, to be honest, this question was different than the one that I applied for a thesis with, and so I think I honestly got a little bit of a late start to it, but I think the fact that it was, to me, so interesting, so puzzling, that I really had a personal interest to want to answer this question rather than something that I'd seen and thought, well, maybe I could just go with this and run. I mean, I haven't fully answered this question. I'm not finished with the project, and I think that's like the one thing that I would say for someone considering this is to really find something that you're personally invested in, because it makes writing about it easier, it makes the research more intriguing, and hopefully at the end you'll still want to keep dealing with the subject.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your question. So I decided on my topic because lawfare being one of like the more up-and-coming aspects of international law. I had taken a class on international law here and also Professor Pauly's coercion class, so that kind of gave me the theoretical underpinnings and kind of wherewithal to be able to engage with the topic like that. I was browsing the Lawfare blog, which my primary reader, Professor Edgar, has written for before, and I was really puzzled by this phenomenon of why these states are suing. I thought it was honestly really interesting and definitely worth looking into, especially because I didn't like many of the answers that people who had written about it had given. I just wanted to approach it from a new way. So over time, the question evolved. It became more case study oriented, but I kind of knew from the onset that it was going to be a very big kind of theoretical paper. And I felt like I had the skills from my previous classes, like the Watson Institute, to be able to do that. So that's how I eventually kind of settled on it. It's just a really new and interesting topic that doesn't have a lot of research on it.
Thank you very much.
My question is actually like Professor Ingham's question and invites you to reflect a bit back on the thesis writing process. And then maybe after this, we'll take a break and get some coffee and switch to our next panel. But I'd like to invite you to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment here. And it's actually a two-part thought experiment. I would love for you to reflect on what is something you now know that you wish you knew at the beginning of your thesis writing process. If you could go back and talk to your September self, what would you say to that self? And then the second thought experiment came to mind as Leo was talking about his archival work, and I imagined this is something you all encountered in your archival work, that missing are these voices, right? So Leo spoke to, I have a lot of documents from the US perspective, but missing were the perspectives of the community that faced US occupation. So I'd also love to hear that if a magic box of documents arrived at your dorm room in March, what would that magic box of documents contain? What other data or evidence do you wish you had had now that you've finished? And now as you're thinking about your next project, what data or evidence remained elusive that you wished you'd had?
I think to the first part of the question, I wish I had spent more of my fall term just reading about my case studies. Not in the sense that I felt like completely unprepared to do that when I got into the research stage later, but the process of extracting information from the reading it in a short period of time is just so different from being able to sit down with, say, a book on the Kako Wars and just sort of reflect on the topic for a while. And I wish I'd had a little more time just to sort of mull over the various cases I had and just think in a way that didn't need to produce an immediate product in the form of some number of pages per day. And I mean, as to the second one, I think my answer here is probably going to be pretty obvious, but I would love to have had a source of correspondence between different insurgent commanders of various levels to get a stronger sense of the internal organization, which I could get a bit from the U.S. documents, in particular, like who was talking to who, but without internal things, it's always a little bit hard to tell beyond sort of the basics of how much bureaucracy there was. Like I wish I had a sense of who was making what decisions, and I could have disaggregated a little more the effect of the assassination of different leaders on their organizations.
I think for me, the part of my thesis that I probably struggle with the most, and I'm sure Dr. Pauly knows well, was my case selection process. And kind of like Eric, I actually went into the thesis process in September with a completely different research question, as Dr. Levitas knows. It was related topics, but I ended up kind of shifting directions a little bit in the middle of fall to what my focus is now. And I think that I maybe got started on the case selection process a little bit later than I would have liked to. And so that was a little bit difficult as far as process goes. So if I could go back in time, I think the natural process of shifting your research question is something that a lot of students will encounter. And like that's something that I would, if I was advising juniors in the audience, say be open to the shifts in your research question. So don't shy away from that. However, once your research question does shift, try to get a handle on the case, what cases you're going to use and why quickly so that you can go into that case research. But the cases that I did settle with, I'm quite happy with. But except for one thing, I do wish for the box of documents in the U.S. Germany Baltics case, if I could just be a fly on the wall in the internal discussions of like the Estonian government, like the Latvian government, the Lithuanian government, like when all they would see a public statement from the U.S. and then they would go meet with like their foreign ministers or something. I just wanted to be in that room and see what was actually being said. And like I think I could have much better evaluated perception if I had access to those documents. Obviously, like I've searched for them. They don't exist currently in the literature because it's probably classified material or it's just not publicly recorded. Even like the U.S., like the foreign relations of the U.S. archives, which is a fantastic archives, but it only goes up to the Reagan administration. There's nothing more recent than that. Like things are being worked on, but the declassification process takes decades often. But yeah, if I could get the internal communications, because I have a hypothesis that the public, and I talk about this in my presentation a bit, that the public projections of confidence that we see from the Baltic states might not be the full story. And they do have incentives to publicly project confidence in their relationship with the United States, which I talk about in my thesis.
I admittedly don't know if I would have taken this class, but I wish there was a class at Brown called How to Write a Literature Review, because I still don't think I know how to do that. And that was certainly the most difficult part of my thesis, so having a bit more of a grasp as to how that process goes and how to place a project within more broader scholarly literature that doesn't exactly, I guess because the literature review that I did was looking at party change, but it had nothing to do specifically with the German Green Party or their decisions. And that was always a bit difficult than to really sort of say, yes, my thesis is placed within this literature, even though it doesn't necessarily deal exactly with what I'm looking at in the later chapters. I also think, I'm speaking from my own experience, but this is the first time that I was embarking on like a year-long sort of academic project. And I think for a lot of the fall, I was sort of just thinking, I could be doing things right now, but like it will get done, and it did. But I think like understanding that those fall months are very important in getting sort of an initial grasp on your case selection, on the literature review, just really trying to stay consistent in the amount of work that's being done early on in the project that really would pay dividends toward the end. And I think, I don't know, we all probably had a bit of a stressful month of April or something because of that. In terms of my box of documents, I think out of the three factions that I looked at, the one that I sort of paid the least amount of attention to were the radical pacifists, because this was the group that didn't change their position on NATO or didn't shift away from their opposition. But I never really looked at why this was the case, and I think that's actually an interesting question, because when so many of the German Greens, when there was an ultimate dominant faction change and that the political pacifists and the Realos changed this position toward NATO, why was it that these radical pacifists, outside from maybe just this general opposition to using any sort of military means to achieve a goal, were there more nuanced takes as to why they kept this longstanding opposition to NATO, regardless of the shifting sort of external situation. So those documents probably exist, and in an extended project, I would probably look at those a bit more in depth. But I would love to look at that next.
So what I would tell myself last semester is to like really focus on scoping out the project. And honestly, not to be too ambitious, because I definitely thought I was going to be writing 2 case studies. I did not. And if I had like thought about that in advance and realized like, wait, this is way too much writing to be able to do in like the spring semester, just focus on one of them now. Start reading about Nicaragua now. Like, don't worry about like your other case studies that you want to do. I think I would have had a much easier time finishing. And as to like the missing perspectives, I can tell you exactly what I was missing, and I spent days trying to find this information, but it's the institutional proceedings of the government, like government records of Nicaragua from 1983 to 1986. I could not find them. If they exist, they're in Spanish. I can't read Spanish very well. So if I were to get a box of those documents, preferably translated, that would definitely have been a game changer, because it would change my whole like institutional design approach to the thesis if I knew like what they were thinking. And the debates on to sue or not to sue are, kind of make it the whole backbone of the thesis.
Well, even without the missing magic boxes of documents, these are excellent theses. Congratulations to all. Excellent work. We will reconvene at 1:45. I think there's some refreshments out in the hallway. We will shift to our next panel on migration, immigration, displacement, and protection. Again, congratulations all.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Faculty, friends, family, those who are joining us online. My name is Claudia Elliott. I'm a senior lecturer in International and Public Affairs here at the Watson Institute. I also teach one of the 2 thesis preparation seminars alongside Professor Tony Levitas, from whom you heard this morning. The seminar is a requirement for those who are in the honors program, and it is a seminar that happens in the fall as students are just starting to embark on their projects. It's my great pleasure to welcome our three presenters and the audience for this second panel this afternoon entitled Migration, Immigration, Displacement, Protection. Lots of slashes in between those words. First, I'd like to say congratulations to all three of you for outstanding work. And I think we're all looking very much forward to hearing about your research on one of the most pressing domestic and global sets of challenges facing us today and in the future. I'm going to introduce the panelists by reading each student's name and their thesis title in the order in which they will speak. And as we did in the previous panel, at the end of the three presentations, we'll open the floor to Q&A. I don't know if I need to remind you that you have 12 minutes, and I have some little time cards up there, but in any case, more or less 12 minutes for your presentation, so that we can have time, as we saw also in the previous panel, for some invigorating and interesting questions and discussion and conversation. We'll begin with Abby Carvajal. Her thesis is entitled The Impact of Armed Conflict and Its Consequences on Women's Migration Decisions, the Guatemalan Civil War and Peru's Internal Armed Conflict. Abby will be followed by Katie Goldenberg, whose work is entitled Responsibility to Protect and Its Effects on Forced Displacement, Humanitarian in Principle or Practice? Big question mark at the end of that one. Katie will be followed by Annette Lee. Annette will be speaking on negotiating symbolic citizenship to safeguard democracy, immigration and democratic consolidation in the case of South Korea. I'd also like to ask you, if it's not prepared or a part of your presentation, to state who your readers are for these projects, and also how you came to the topics. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank my advisors, Professor Kinzer over there and Professor Luis sitting in the back over there. Thank you so much for your continuous support and guidance throughout this process. Also, thank you to Professor Elliott, who was my thesis seminar instructor leader and provided me with also a lot of guidance. My name is Abigail Carvajal, and today I'll be presenting some research findings for my honors thesis titled The Impact of Armed Conflict on Women's Migration Decisions and on the Guatemalan Civil War and Peru's Internal Armed Conflict. When I was brainstorming what I wanted to do my thesis on, I knew that I wanted to focus on migration. I grew up in an immigrant household, and a lot of my academics and experiences have been focused on migration studies, so I felt like this was something I was sure I wanted to study. However, I wasn't really sure what exactly in migration I wanted to focus on until I started delving into armed conflict statistics. The vast majority of deaths in armed conflict are men that are married or live with their partner. And you may wonder, why does this matter? Statistics are not often gender specific, so the stories of women's experiences during armed migration are not so obvious. But under the surface, we see that women face unique forms of violence that are central to their identities as women, mothers, sisters, and partners. When family members die, it is the women that are left as witnesses to the violence that is still continuing and are responsible for seeking safety for themselves, their families, and other loved ones. Thus, women and their dependents make up the majority of migrants. And the unique experiences of women during armed conflict that prompt many to migrate led me to my overarching research question: how does armed conflict and its consequences impact women's migration decision? And to answer this question, I asked a more specific research question: how did armed conflict and its consequences impact women's migration decisions during the Guatemalan Civil War and Peru's internal armed conflict? Since I wanted to focus on women's migration decisions specifically, my literature review consisted of existing migration theories. And I found that existing scholarship on this topic breaks down into four main categories. First, micro-level migration theories. These are migration theories that are focused on individual values, desires, and experiences. These include the aspirations capabilities framework, Lee's push and pull model, neoclassical micro-migration theory, and behavior theory. The second category is meso-level migration theories, which are concerned with migration networks or the roles of one's connections and contexts in migration. These include social capital theory, institutional theory, network theory, cumulative causation theory, and the new economics of labor migration theory. The third category is macro level migration theories, which are centered around opportunity structures, and these opportunity structures may be economic or employment structures available at a migrant's destination. These include neoclassical macro migration theory, dual labor market theory, world systems theory, mobility transitions theory, and the theory of mobility. And finally, the fourth category is feminist migration theories that focus on the role of gender in migration, which include gender in the migratory process, gender geographies of power, stages of migration, and migration through a feminist lens. While each of the theories displayed here offer unique insights into the migration process, I argue that they're insufficient to analyze women's experiences during armed conflict. Existing migration theories view migration as a binary with two outcomes, as you can see, migration and non-migration. This binary does not take into account that migration decisions are not black and white, and especially when the added factors of armed conflict and gender are brought in. Women's migration decisions are complicated by their identities and the place they hold within society, along with the added threat of armed conflict, where women face distinct forms of violence from their male counterparts. The gap in existing literature and migration theories led me to my research design. To answer my research question, I used Robert Ian's concept of a case study, since I asked an explanatory question in which contemporary events are analyzed and when the events cannot be manipulated. I chose to use the Guatemalan Civil War and Peru's internal armed conflict as my two case studies. There are several reasons why I chose these two conflicts and these two countries as my research design and to trace migration decisions. Guatemala and Peru have several similarities that facilitate comparison. Both countries are in Latin America and share some cultural similarities. The main one I focused on was widespread machismo culture, involving rigid gender roles that manifest in educational, social, and economic inequalities. The similarity eliminates the need to try to account for various cultural differences and the way those cultural differences manifest during the comparison of the study. Next, Guatemala and Peru are two of the countries with the highest indigenous populations in the world. Around 26% of Peru's population and 44% of Guatemala's population are considered indigenous. This is significantly higher than countries such as the United States, where only 3% of the population is considered indigenous. In both Guatemala and Peru, indigenous populations are of the most marginalized and thus were disproportionately impacted during the armed conflicts. This similarities facilitates comparison since I wouldn't have to account for the demographic differences and the way different demographics are impacted by armed conflict. And finally, both conflicts occurred and ended roughly around the same time. The Guatemalan Civil War began in 1960, while Sendero Luminoso, which was the main group that the Peruvian military and government fought against during the armed conflict, was founded in 1969. Both conflicts ended around in the late 1990s, and eliminating the need to account for the differences in time periods also facilitates a comparison. Overall, these similarities facilitate comparison without being too similar, as there are less cultural, demographic, and time differences that need to be accounted for when analyzing and comparing the conflicts. It is also important to acknowledge that I have personal interest in investigating armed conflicts' impact on women's migration through these conflicts and countries. I grew up hearing stories of the conflict between Peru's government and Sendero Luminoso and how it impacted my family's lives and was ultimately the reason why many of my family members migrated. This influence shaped my academic interests from a young age and led me to want to study this topic from an academic perspective rather than a personal one. I have also interacted with Guatemalan communities in my hometown and in Providence through volunteer work, events, and assisting with asylum cases over the past several years. These interactions allow me to learn about the Guatemalan Civil War through first-hand accounts of those who fled. In addition to these personal experiences, I have the language skills and familiarity with the conflicts and the region that facilitated this research. A critical reason that I chose to study two countries in Latin America is so that I would not need to rely on translated documents, and thus I could have a broader range of sources and conduct a more thorough study. I first began reading about the conflicts from a general perspective. This included looking at statistics, government reports, books, testimonies, archives, and a few interviews that I conducted. I first wanted to gain a general perspective of how these conflicts began, who were the actors, and who were the most affected populations. I then narrowed my focus to the experiences of women during these two conflicts, ranging from high-class women and high-ranking officials to Quechua and Quichua women who were disproportionately impacted during the conflicts. I began analyzing statistics and anecdotes specific to these women, and I tracked the experiences and migration decisions-making process of these women. And once I compared the narratives to each other and to those in the other conflict, I categorized the anecdotes into 4 categories that represented general migration trends that I identified. The tracking of these trends led me to form the marginalization migration model, with these 4 categories to analyze women's migrations during armed conflict. This model starts on the left-hand side with a gradient that shows women's level of marginalization. A woman's level of marginalization prior to an armed conflict dictates the extent to which that conflict will impact her. So women who were highly marginalized prior to conflicts were likely to be disproportionately impacted by those conflicts, while non-marginalized women would be impacted the least by the conflicts. Women who are highly marginalized and face the brunt of conflicts are likely to have low capabilities but high aspirations to migrate. This means that women would have the high desire to migrate but would not have the resources or ability to do so. On the other hand, women who are not as impacted by the conflict have high capabilities but low aspirations to migrate. The combinations of aspirations plus capabilities determines the amount of agency that a woman has. So low aspirations plus high capabilities equates to high agency, and vice versa, while high aspirations but low capabilities result in low agency. Thus, women that are highly marginalized prior to the conflict have low agency, and women who were not marginalized prior to the conflict have high levels of agency. Those who had low levels of agencies are likely to be forcibly trapped or forcibly displaced by the violence. Those with high levels of agencies are likely to voluntarily migrate or voluntarily not migrate due to being less impacted by the conflict. I argue that women's migration during armed conflict cannot be analyzed as a binary because it's a lot more complicated than that. Instead, women's migration during armed conflict is best analyzed as gradients that are largely influenced by women's place within society. This thesis has theoretical implications for migration studies that give way to several practical applications. I hope that the marginalization migration model will promote new scholarship and theoretical work in migration studies. I specifically hope that more work will be conducted looking at the intersection between experiences during armed conflict and people's identities. This includes people's identities in regard to gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. The research that stems from the theoretical implications will give way to practical applications. This includes promoting preventative measures to recognize vulnerable populations before conflict so that they do not face the same extent of the impacts. These preventative measures include, but are not limited to, development efforts and providing safe havens for those who would likely be impacted. Furthermore, research will inform immigration policies, refugee policies, refugee reception plans, and plans to relieve stress from refugee-receiving communities. Finally, the increase in thorough scholarship will also help voters in the sense that they will be more informed to vote for candidates that align with their views on migration and refugee policies. I want to leave you all with some main points from this research. The first of which is that women's migration during armed conflict cannot be viewed as a binary with only 2 options of migration and non-migration. The identities of women and the threat of armed conflict complicates decisions and agency. Thus, women's migration during armed conflict should be analyzed as gradients and not binaries. Second, women who are more marginalized have less agency and are thus more likely to be forcibly trapped or forcibly displaced. On the other hand, women who face little to no marginalization prior to the conflict have ample agency that allows them to voluntarily migrate or voluntarily non-migrate. Migration and non-migration are significantly impacted by women's place within society. We all need to think about what we as citizens, voters, policymakers, and scholars can do to address the racial, economic, and social marginalizations that led to these conflicts and these outcomes. We must address the marginalization of these conflicts and how some people were immensely impacted and others were hardly impacted. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Hello, everyone. First, I would just like to say thank you to my advisors, Professor Nina Tannenwald and David Pilati, without whom this project would not have been possible, and a thank you to my seminar advisor, Professor Tony Levitas. I wrote my thesis on the responsibility to protect doctrine and its failure to address the issue of forced displacement during humanitarian intervention. The idea for this thesis arose out of two places. First, Professor Tannenwald's International Law and Human Rights class, which was the first place I learned about R2P, and the focus on displacement stemmed from my internship at the UNHCR, or the UN Refugee Agency, during my junior year, in which I worked with detained asylum seekers in the US, and the stories of my grandparents who fled from Austria to the US as refugees from the Holocaust. So this thesis is really an effort to centralize forced displacement and refugee issues in my studies of conflict and intervention. First, before diving into the contents of this thesis, I want to explain what is the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, or R2P. R2P is a UN doctrine or statement of international policy that was unanimously passed by UN member states at the 2005 World Summit outcome in New York. It's not a treaty in that it's not legally binding, it's only a guiding principle for humanitarian intervention, and it attempted to reform a series of weak interventions throughout the 1990s. It attempts to do this by reframing the principle of sovereignty, or the idea that governments are free to do what they want within their own territory, and R2P says governments can't do whatever they want. Under Pillar 1, states have a responsibility to protect their populations from the atrocity crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Under Pillar 2, they will uphold this responsibility with assistance from the international community. And under Pillar 3, in the case that a state fails to protect its populations, the international community can take collective action according to the UN Charter, prioritizing diplomatic and humanitarian measures first, with use of force as a last resort. So I want to go back to those weak interventions that I mentioned that occurred during the 1990s. First, there was the UN's non-intervention into the Rwandan genocide, a series of weak UN interventions into Somalia, Sierra Leone, and Bosnia, which saw the collapse or inadequacy of peacekeeping efforts, and lastly, NATO's intervention into Kosovo in 1999, which was unauthorized by the Security Council and a legal violation of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. In each of these events, there was obviously a focus on those who were killed because these were genocides and ethnic cleansings, but each of these events also created massive displacement crises that were only cited briefly when I learned about them in class. And it brought me to the central question of this thesis. Given the waves of displacement that arose and persisted in the face of apparently humanitarian interventions of the 1990s, why did it appear that states dedicated little attention to the issue of forced displacement when trying to reform humanitarian intervention through R2P? Forced displacement is not explicitly referenced in the 2005 formulation of R2P, and there is also sparing reference in later documents. But as we have seen in the 1990s, and especially in Kosovo, intervening with force will inevitably contribute to displacement. So did state and non-state actors consider how to mitigate the displacement that would likely accompany a coercive R2P intervention? And second, how did this apparent lack of attention to forced displacement impact states' abilities to prevent a displacement crisis in 2011 Libya, when they deployed their first military R2P intervention? First, I want to clarify that when I say state and non-state actors, for state actors, I'm referring to state representatives or government officials who are involved in R2P debates, and for non-state actors, I'm talking about humanitarian groups and advocates, and I specifically focus on the UNHCR, or the UN Refugee Agency, in this thesis. I mostly analyzed qualitative data, and I analyzed the discourse in UN documents and debates, country statements, civil society reports, and roundtable transcripts. I was looking at references to displacement and what kind of language was used to frame displacement. I also conducted personal interviews with 2 practitioners at the UNHCR involved in R2P debates, as well as 1 state commissioner involved in the drafting of an early R2P report. I conducted a historical process tracing approach in which I wrote an interpretive history of R2P's development, which placed a renewed focus on the debates and language surrounding forced displacement. I structured my research timeline around 2 case studies. I began with Kosovo in 1999 as a case of pre-R2P intervention, and I ended with Libya in 2011 as a case of post-R2P intervention. And I was looking at whether there were any substantial improvements in operational procedures, protection strategies, civil-military coordination, especially when it related to displacement. I also looked at Darfur in 2003 as a case in which R2P could have been deployed but was not ultimately authorized. And I was looking at whether there were calls to implement R2P and whether they linked intervention to displacement. I wrote an interpretive history of R2P, and I was focusing on what explained its final content as an international norm. So in Chapter 2, which was my literature review, I explored realist, liberal, and constructivist perspectives on how power, institutions, and pressures to state social identities each respectively played a role in shaping R2P. My thesis's focus diverges from this R2P scholarship in that I place a new focus on the issue of forced displacement during R2P's development, and the issue of displacement when R2P was put into military operations specifically, highlighting how the use of force during intervention inevitably leads to displacement. So my thesis thus contributes to a fuller image of how power, institutions, and identities interacted during R2P's development. In Chapter 3, Early Framings of R2P, I focus on the founding document, the 2001 International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which was the earliest set of guidelines on R2P. In Chapter 4, I look at achieving the World Summit consensus on R2P, and I focus on the debates and conversations leading up to the outcome and the outcome document itself. And in Chapter 5, I look at when conversations shifted to operational practices, including the implementing responsibility to protect report in 2009, the 2011 Libya intervention and accompanying UN resolutions, and I explored Security Council discussions and the actual operational procedures used by NATO and humanitarian groups. I find that leading humanitarian advocates and groups were the most vocal when it came to displacement. State representatives were more concerned with R2P's threat to sovereignty. However, state commissioners were the ones who drafted the 2005 outcome report, and in doing so, they prioritized state interests in sovereignty and passing a unanimous consensus over humanitarians' focus on operationalizing R2P, which often included concerns about mitigating displacement. There was also a lack of consensus on operational standards between states and humanitarians, so it meant that there were no safeguards against an intervening party prioritizing political rather than humanitarian objectives. And this created weaknesses I identified in the NATO operation. For example, NATO's airstrikes targeting Gaddafi often contributed to a rise in displacement. NATO provided military support to rebel groups that destroyed civilian infrastructure and blocked humanitarian access to fleeing civilians. While options existed for NATO to use armed force to protect displaced populations, it often neglected to use them, and NATO often failed to contribute to efforts to aid displaced populations post-conflict. I highlight the realist factors in R2P's development, despite broader constructivist and liberal victories R2P as a whole may represent. The state desire for power and security meant that they were more concerned about threats to their sovereignty and viewed displacement mitigation as a last resort or secondary approach to intervention, and they viewed displaced populations as security threats and byproducts of intervention. Humanitarians positioned displaced persons as priorities of intervention rather than byproducts. I argue that refugee protection strategies both fit directly under R2P's Pillar 3 and should be explicitly referenced as part of the collective action by the international community. States are already obligated to asylum and resettlement under the Refugee Convention, and there already exist guiding principles for displacement, a document on which R2P was founded. So there already exist clear operational frameworks that can be repurposed as mandatory sets of practices states can employ prior to and during intervention. How do we encourage states to reconcile these principles? I invoke ideas raised by the scholar Elise Cohen, who relates strategies of climate justice movements to motivating states towards humanitarian action. And in this case, I apply the notion of culpability to the displacement issue, or the idea that states must perceive themselves as stakeholders in resolving displacement issues. States who have higher culpability in displacement crises must accept a higher responsibility to respond. Lastly, while operational standards for R2P do exist, states must reconvene in the presence of humanitarians to resolve critical questions that will implicate their ability to curb displacement, such as at what point is coercive intervention necessary, and how will states and humanitarians coordinate to aid displacement when humanitarians have to uphold their humanitarian principle of neutrality. These guidelines will create accountability and visibility that will help to pressure states into adhering to humanitarian over political objectives. Currently, R2P faces significant reputational concerns. Many states view it as an excuse for larger states to intervene in the domestic affairs of smaller states in cases of neo-imperialism. And this is exacerbated by the lasting damage in Libya. Not only was there a persisting displacement crisis, where by 2014, between 600,000 and 1 million Libyan refugees remained in Tunisia, almost 10 to 15% of the Libyan population before intervention. But the images on my slides depict the level of damage to civilian infrastructure. And today, Libya is still considered a failed state. So it is impossible to say what would have occurred if NATO did not intervene, but what this thesis argues is that a focus on displaced populations as victims of atrocity crimes, rather than byproducts of coercive intervention, will help to ensure that R2P becomes humanitarian in principle and in practice. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Annette, and I of course could not have done this thesis without my two readers, Professors Claudia Elliott and Hesuk Wang, who gave me a lot of guidance and support throughout this whole process. So I am interested here in the effects of immigration, and that's something that I've been interested in for a long time. So what I looked at in this thesis specifically was how immigration affects democracy. And there's not very much work on this topic, and what there is pretty inconclusive. So some people say that immigration actually leads to the strengthening and enriching of democracy, but then there are also some people who say that actually, no, it creates conflict and tension and instability. And so I wanted to get at the heart of this question of what determines whether it's one outcome or the other. And so at the bottom is sort of a preview of my findings. It's okay if they don't make complete sense right now. This presentation will kind of go through my process to getting there. So first, I will talk about what democratic consolidation and immigration actually are and what they have to do with each other. So I kind of assume that everyone here has a basic idea of what immigration is and its global importance and influence. I just want to quickly point out that immigration over the past few decades has actually been changing. So that's in terms of where immigration is coming from. So now it's much less likely to come from European countries. And as this image shows, it's going to different places as well. And so this is something that is, in today's world, actively changing. And these flows of immigration then have an impact on the countries that are receiving them, and specifically they create these conversations and debates about who belongs in the society, who is a citizen, who is a member. And what I'm interested in is how those debates and conversations then impact democratic stability. So what is democratic stability? That is a question that a lot of scholars have grappled with by specifically looking at this concept called democratic consolidation, which is an amalgam of many different ideas and theories. These scholars do not all agree, but here is sort of a basic breakdown of how they think about how this happens. So you don't have to read all of the text. The main point is that they think of democratic consolidation as something that becomes achieved at a certain point after ticking certain requirements and boxes. And then after that, great, the democracy is consolidated. We've done it. The end. But this idea has kind of fallen out of fashion more recently because, well, there are several democracies that we've thought were consolidated, but actually they've been experiencing what some people call deconsolidation, which means that there's this active deterioration in these qualities of democratic governance, which some people call backsliding or erosion. And that has led to some people being like, okay, clearly this democratic consolidation thing does not work. But I actually argue that this means that the idea of democratic stability is more important than ever. We just have to think about it in a different way. So how do I talk about democratic consolidation in my paper? Well, I draw significantly and heavily from Andreas Schedler, who kind of did this breakdown of different ways that people were thinking about democratic consolidation. Basically, the bottom ones are kind of in line with that. We want to reach this certain threshold, we want to achieve democratic consolidation, and then our job is finished. Versus the ones at the top kind of take a different approach. They're thinking, what are the risks and challenges to democracy that we can then respond to continuously? And so this is a process that happens again and again in a changing world and changing environment. And that is sort of how I approach this idea. So, my actual case study selection was South Korea, and I chose it because it is really actively changing right now in terms of its demographics, immigration, and how people are responding to that immigration. So it has historically been one of the most, or the least ethnically diverse countries in the world, and it still, I think, is in like the top 10 of that group. But what's interesting is that over the past few decades, there's been a really significant increase in migrants, and it is accelerating, as you can see from this graph. And so I specifically looked at two events in South Korea's history with immigration. So first is the 2003 employment permit system, which is a policy that was passed to kind of protect labor migrants' rights, and specifically labor rights. But at the same time, it kind of kept in place certain limits or added certain restrictions. And then second is this backlash that happened in 2018 after several hundred Yemeni refugees arrived in South Korea. There were a lot of people who were very vocal about opposing these refugees, and as a result, the government actually added restrictions to refugee policies. And then as for how I analyze these things, I use a combination of a few different methods. I spoke with several experts on this topic in Korea. I also looked at several surveys from both of these timeframes and how they, and the results specifically on questions about how people were thinking about democracy and citizenship and membership in their society. And then finally, I did a distributional semantics analysis of more than 4,000 government press releases and newspaper editorials. And to put it briefly, distributional semantics is the use of machine learning to analyze text, to look at which words co-occur or appear in proximity to each other, with the idea that words that consistently appear next to each other are related. And then so specifically, I looked at what words were appearing the most often in relation to four key terms, which were democracy, democratization, citizens, and citizenry. And then so my results overall, to put it in one like brief sentence, is that there was this lack of inclusivity and therefore a failure to adapt to this changing social reality. So this is just one small example of how inclusivity failed to increase and maybe by certain metrics decreased. So these are results from newspapers before 2003 versus before 2020 or before 2020, and the words that were associated with democracy. And you can see that at first there were these terms like harmony, unity, coexistence that were really heavily associated with the term of democracy, but then as time has gone on, those have sort of become less important. And this is backed up by just also the analysis of surveys and the conversations I've had with experts on this topic, that overall, even though there have been several policies passed on immigration over this period, they fundamentally are limited in promoting and encouraging citizens to think about who actually belongs in this society, not just legally, but what I call symbolically, like what people actually believe and feel and value. And this is all bad for democracy because it continues to exacerbate polarization and fragmentation, which are big risk factors for backsliding. And so the implications of this, I hope that everyone takes away that immigration and democracy are both really big forces in the world right now, unlikely to disappear overnight, and also still actively changing. It's not the same as it was maybe 50 years ago. And so it's really important to understand how states can respond to these potential risks of backsliding and safeguard their democracies, and specifically looking at the effect of immigration in terms of symbolic citizenship. Yeah, that's just an example of how democracy has been changing worldwide over the past several decades. And then as for policy, I make a couple recommendations in my thesis about some of the reasons why I believe that inclusivity failed in South Korea and probably in other cases as well. First, there's this lack of inclusion in the political process for immigrants, especially on issues that pertain to them personally. And I give some examples in my paper about how this could be done. And then second, I find that education and multicultural education is really important for giving people the tools to grapple with these issues of like, who is in our society? What is their relationship to me? Do they belong here or not? How do I decide that? And there has been a lot of criticism of South Korea's multicultural education, which the government has tried to implement. But this goes beyond South Korea. I think the point I want to make is that education about multicultural issues can't just be about these faraway countries or other cultures that are in other places. It has to be made really relevant to the students' lives and how they're thinking about their own world. And so I hope that this diagram makes a little more sense now in terms of how I believe that immigration affects democratic stability. So first, because of this immigration and these changes in the demographics and society, there are these public debates about who belongs on symbolic citizenship. And then the state kind of responds to this and elevates certain viewpoints. And this impacts the ideas and behaviors or political culture in terms of how inclusive it is towards these new people. And then that ultimately is a reflection of how stable the democracy is. So I'm not saying here that more inclusive equals better democracy. I'm specifically saying that in the context of these demographic changes brought about by immigration, the state's capability to actually adapt and respond to those changes by being more inclusive and accommodating to immigrants is a sign of their overall ability to adapt in general and to maintain their stability. So I hope that everyone kind of takes away that immigration and democracy are both really two key pressing issues and they're not going to change. I mean, the pandemic didn't stop immigration. It's still going to happen. And so as these established and aging democracies are encountering these new changes and tensions, I just want to say that it's imperative that we all take steps to redefine who we collectively are.
Thank you, all three of you, for outstanding theses and outstanding presentations. We can now open the floor to Q&A. And I'm happy to begin. I will start off with a question for each of you. Beginning, I'm going to go backwards. Beginning with Annette. Annette, the title of your thesis is Negotiating Symbolic Citizenship to Safeguard Democracy. Having read the thesis, I know that you mentioned that in chapter 1, and you mentioned it again in the conclusion. I don't know that you mentioned it today, but also I would like to know what you mean by negotiating here? How do we negotiate a culture, a political identity, a national identity? Are we talking about actually sitting down at the table and hammering things out in terms of policy? Or is it something broader, something more constructive over a long period of time? So I wonder if you would address that. And then I'm going to ask for Katie. Regarding policy implications of your study. From what you know, or from your analysis, let me ask it this way. Does your analysis suggest that there will be pressure to expand R2P in the future so that it covers more things like refugees, or instead to reduce it so that it does less, for example, less military intervention? Kind of related to that is, or perhaps do we need a responsibility to protect refugees that's entirely different from R2P as we know it now? And for Abby. I've got a lot of papers here. Your thesis, I found your thesis so interesting and your model quite compelling, the marginalization migration model with its 4 categories of scale, based on more or less resources, social status, economic status, education. And then your evidence, or it was derived from your experiences of real people whose stories reflect those categories in your 2 case studies, Guatemala and Peru. For me, what's not new here is that the more resources you have, the wider range of choices you have. But I do think that personal stories as illustrations do add to your theoretical contribution against the yes-no binary of migration. So my question is, given that the cases, the Guatemala and Peru, are really so similar, what research design change would you make to be able to create a study that might be generalizable outside of those 2 cases with those types of, you're calling a machismo culture, and cases in Latin America happening at the same, with conflicts happening at the same time? Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for that question. You're right that it is in my title, and I write about it in my thesis, but I didn't really get into it today. But when I talk about negotiation, I'm talking about this process of adaptation, basically, of people figuring out what they think societal membership actually means. So there's a lot of different perspectives on the place of different groups and people in society, and there's not usually uniform agreement about these topics. And so what happens is that through discourse and just over time, people discuss and interchange ideas about these issues. But specifically, I focus on the political process and how this negotiation happens in the political process. So specifically, when people are discussing different policies or ways that we should respond to these issues, they're presenting these different viewpoints. And what I argue is that this negotiation process itself has to be inclusive in order to be effective. So the people who have maybe been excluded in the past need to have a seat at the table, which is one of the reasons why I believe that immigrants and people with that lived experience need to really be a key part of making these decisions. But yeah, I think the reason I use the word negotiation is to specifically get at the idea that this is not an overnight change that happens by just the government making decisions from up high and then everyone else falling in line. This is about people's ideas and feelings, and that requires time to sort of process and change. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think I would argue that we need to reduce we need to reduce use of military operations and move towards prioritizing humanitarian measures under R2P's Pillar 3, which includes already operations that are elaborated in the 1951 Refugee Convention, like getting states to uphold their commitment to asylum and resettlement and non-refoulement. Cases of refoulement did occur in the Libya intervention. And I would argue that that is the priority before moving to the use of force. But in the use of force, there also needs to exist humanitarian operations that are prioritized at all times over operations that are politically oriented. And I don't know if I would say necessarily that there should be a responsibility to protect refugees, because we already have the 1951 Refugee Convention. I think that these principles, the principles of refugee protection and R2P, need to be seen as complementary, and even the principles of refugee protection embedded in the responsibility to protect, rather than creating an additional separate principle.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Professor Elliott. In response to the connecting theory to personal narratives, I think that was one of my main goals coming into this thesis, was to try to connect gaps in literature and gaps in existing theories with more personal narratives and personal experiences. As to expanding the research to a more generalizable thing, I think there's obvious benefits to expanding it. And I chose 2 countries in Latin America for different reasons, but in the future I would like to conduct the study and expand on it with other countries. I decided against that for this thesis for a variety of reasons that I mentioned some in the presentation. The main reason is a language. I think when you're trying to connect narratives and personal experiences with theory, it's really hard to do so without speaking the language of the country you are researching. And for that reason, I chose 2 countries in Latin America, because I speak Spanish and English. And I think that aided the study a lot by allowing me to connect with people and hear the narratives and use firsthand sources, because I do think there is a lot lost with translated documents, and rather than having documents in the original language.
Good answer. Thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you. Other questions? Do you have the microphone?
A question, thank you first. They were all very great presentations, and I know one thesis well, the other 2 I don't know at all, but really impressive work. I'm curious to ask, in the course of doing your research, what was the thing that you found most surprising, most difficult to explain, that ran counter to your expectations?
I guess I can start. I think the main thing I found difficult in the research is that the biggest limitation to my research study was that when studying armed conflict, the people who are most impacted by the conflict are dead. And if not, it brings up a lot of trauma to explain the stories. So I relied primarily on first-hand documents that I could find and testimonies that were held by truth commissions or other things. I think also another limitation was that there's not a lot of literature and a lot of statistics that are specific to women, and that's something I think would have really aided this study more in terms of finding out the exact number of women who were affected, the exact number of women who migrated to a certain place, and I think that would have been very helpful.
I can go next. I think what I found surprising in my research was that humanitarian groups and advocates were not always super involved in these discussions surrounding R2P, and a lot of that I discovered was because of these humanitarian principles of neutrality, one of which is humanitarian principles, one of which is neutrality, in which humanitarians often need to uphold a principle of neutrality to even enter conflict zones or gain credibility. So I had expected that a lot of displacement advocates might have been more involved in these discussions, but and while many were, other organizations took a back seat in the interest of upholding neutrality.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think for me, the hardest thing to untangle was definitely the different ways that people thought about how willing they are to include immigrants or people with like foreign backgrounds in different contexts. And so there's not really a clear-cut answer of like, oh, they uniformly became less or more inclusive during this time. By some metrics, they're more. By some metrics, they're less. By some metrics, they're the same. And this is also difficult because we're looking at what people believe, and we can only really measure that realistically by looking at what they report themselves a lot of the time. And so that was also definitely challenging because I'd be like, wait, why are people so open to working with these with immigrants as coworkers, but as soon as you mention like intermarriage, they like shut down super fast.
Thank you. Fantastic work. Thank you for sharing your research with us. My question is actually for Annette Lee. I'm not particularly well-versed in South Korea's political climate and everything, and I was wondering who are the people who are immigrating there and why are they coming there?
Yeah, I get this question a lot whenever I told people my topic. They're like, so who's immigrating to South Korea? And so the short explanation is that most of the people immigrating to South Korea are migrants from other parts of Asia, and specifically Southeast Asia is pretty well represented. But the reasons and motivations are quite varied, and these different groups they're treated so differently by the government that sometimes it's hard to talk about them as one group. Like in the literature and in research, there's not like one common word to describe immigrants and their descendants. Like they just are kind of parceled into different categories. So there are people, the largest group is labor migrants, who are filling some of the labor shortages that are a result of the plummeting fertility rate and birth rate in South Korea. But there's also a lot of marriage migrants who are predominantly female versus the labor migrants are predominantly male. And then also there are refugees, as I mentioned. So a lot of different groups, and I'm not going to say that they like constitute like a huge portion of South Korea's population, but the population of immigrants did recently, in the last few years, surpass 2 million. So it is growing quite rapidly.
Phenomenal presentations, all three of you. You should be very proud of yourselves. My question is for Katie. I am very curious to hear about where your research took you in the contemporary conflict of the Russia-Ukraine war and where R2P fits into this ongoing conflict. Would you explicitly consider it a failure, and why? And how must international bodies reconcile with these two concepts of sovereignty and protecting human rights in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war and R2P?
Yeah, so I didn't dive too much into Russia-Ukraine in my own research because R2P mostly refers to states committing atrocity crimes against their own populations, versus with Russia-Ukraine as a case study, a lot of it is Russians committing atrocity crimes against Ukrainians. So it wasn't really a case study that I went too much into.
Thanks all of you for wonderful presentations. I've got a question for Abby. The women that migrate, who you covered in your studies of Peru and Guatemala, to where do they migrate? Are they actual refugees who go to other countries? Or do they remain displaced people within their own countries? And why would they make those different choices? And what choices did they make in those two countries?
Thank you for your question, Professor Kinzer. Yeah, I didn't dive into this too much in my presentation, but one of the main differences that I found between Guatemala and Peru is that in Guatemala, it was more international migration. So if you were impacted by the conflict, you could go to Chiapas in Mexico across the border, or some tried to migrate to the United States through licit and illicit channels. While in Peru, a lot of the migration was either internal, or people with more resources would go internationally to the United States or Europe. in my research study, I found that the women of higher classes and of higher positions in Peruvian and Guatemalan society, most of them stayed within their own countries because the conflicts did not affect them as much. Then you move to the people who were voluntarily migrating, and those people weren't as much affected directly by the conflicts, but were impacted indirectly by the consequences of conflict. And like what I mean by that is, in Peru, for example, one of the women that I read her story, she was more impacted by the economic crisis that ensued a little bit during and after the conflict. So she wasn't directly affected by the violence, but was affected by the economic consequences of the conflict. And for that reason, she came to the United States and saw economic opportunities there. And then you move down the marginalization gradient, and you found that women who were forcibly trapped or forcibly displaced didn't have as many resources to migrate, and for that reason, you had to go where some place that was convenient. So if you were forcibly trapped, you were trapped between the forces of violence around you. But if you were forcibly displaced, you go somewhere where you can survive. You don't really have the option to say, pick where you're going to migrate. Most of the time, in the case of Guatemala, it was to Chiapas across the border, where there's a large Maya and Quichua population and community there. In Peru, it was mainly you went from the highlands of Peru to the coastal cities, or you moved towards an urban center.
I have a couple questions. These are great. So for Annette, I noticed the words North Korea in your distributional semantics in the more modern era. I often think about the challenges of inclusion as partly connected with fear, a sense of people's fear that somehow they will be harmed by creating more inclusive democracy. And I'm wondering if there's anything to that in the sense that the experience of South Koreans worrying about the threat of the North has increased in recent years. And then I have a question for Abby.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think fear is definitely a big part of it. And part of the important context, I think, for South Korea is that a lot of these ideas about ethnic homogeneity, which were promoted by the state and also on a more like social level, these ideas developed directly in response to past conflict and worries about the destruction of Korean culture. So in the face of like Japanese colonization and then also the Korean War, there was like a lot of fear about the loss of cultural knowledge and I think uniqueness. And also there was this necessity to create like a new national identity for this very new country. And so the idea of ethnic homogeneity was directly as a result of those factors. And so I do think that you're right about fear being a big part of this, because when a lot of people, when they think about threats to this ethnic homogeneity, they're not just thinking about like our demographics. It's a larger fear about their society being destroyed. And it does come from a real history.
And then for Abby, both Abby and Katie, I really appreciated the comparative case study. Again, you did such a great job with thinking about cases that have a lot in common or slightly different. And for Abby, you talked about indigeneity as one of the central factors that united the cases that were very similar. What were some of the differences that you saw between Peru and Guatemala that you thought were most essential? You talked about kind of resources, you talked about kind of broad things, but I'm curious about how they played out differently.
Thank you so much for your question. I think the main difference I found is the type of migration that ensued. So Guatemala is closer to the United States, it's closer to a lot of smaller countries nearby, and for that reason, a lot of the migration was displacement towards Mexico or sometimes seeking entry to the United States through illicit channels. Whereas Peru, I think the main difference is it's in South America, a lot further away from a country such as the United States. So people with more resources would go to the United States, whereas in Guatemala's case, you could try to seek illicit entries of entrance to the United States. And also in Peru, I think internal displacement is a big part of the story there, moving from the highlands to coastal cities. I think that was one of the main differences, whereas in Guatemala, you didn't really see as much internal migration. There was some to Guatemala City, but in the end, you could cross the border. It was closer to go to Mexico, and you could build a community there. question behind you.
Hi all, thanks so much for presenting. I've taken classes with some of you, so it's really cool to get to learn from you guys again. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about definitions of democracy. I'm in a class with Professor Elliott where we've talked about that a lot, and I imagine it came up in your research. So I think something that a lot of definitions of democracy have in common is that they're sort of ignoring this symbolic aspect that you've discussed in your research. So for example, if you're trying to make an index of democracy, that index is likely to kind of say if people, for example, immigrants, have the right to vote, they have the right to free assembly, etc., then that's sort of good enough, and that's leaving out the symbolic aspect that you're talking about, where do people in that society think that people should have these rights? So I'm curious that whether you think this symbolic aspect is something that we should be including in indices of democracy, or whether it's kind of adding something that's not necessary to the definition.
Yeah, there are, as you've probably learned in that class, many, many, many definitions of democracy, and everyone has their own opinion about what is important and what is peripheral. So I think the point, I guess one of the ideas that I put forth here is that legal and institutional inclusivity is directly linked to social and, as you say, like symbolic. And so I think the difficulty, again, of making that an official indicator or measure is that it's really difficult to get at objectively. You can do polls, but that's people's own expression and reporting of how they feel. And also, I think it's also complicated because there have historically been democracies that maybe weren't super inclusive in certain dimensions, but they were pretty stable and functioned for their current context. Like when South Korea just had a very, very small foreign population, you could argue that inclusivity of like culturally different groups was not super important for them. But I guess what I'm trying to argue is that this is about context, and so the symbolic aspect needs to adapt and change with the situation.
Well, thank you. Abby, if you don't mind, I'd also like to ask you a question. I know you talked about the binary between migration and non-migration, and I think another binary that exists is between like migrants and refugees. And I was curious if that binary sort of played a role in your research at all, particularly given that I would imagine that the gendered aspect would also contribute to whether people are being perceived as refugees or as migrants.
Thank you for your question. That's a great question. I didn't touch on this in the presentation, but in my thesis, I have a section talking about concepts, and in that section, I talk about the differences between who's considered a refugee, who's considered a migrant, who's considered an internally displaced person, and how those definitions are really blurred, and they're very politicized, and there's not a clear answer for a lot of them. So for that reason, I chose to use the term migrant to encompass people who may be considered refugees, people who may be considered migrants, and people who may be considered internally displaced persons, and anywhere in between where those blurred lines are.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I had a question for Katie. Just listening to you talk about all the different like humanitarian groups and how they all have different interests, I was wondering how you decided to focus on the UNHCR specifically. Was it just because of your experience interning there? Or did you feel like their experience was a good model for some reason for the case studies you focused on?
Yeah, so the UNHCR is the leading refugee protection organization, so they're responsible for coordinating all other refugee protection groups during an intervention. And so I wanted to focus, they're apolitical in mandate, so they're not really supposed to be involved in political discussions, but they have played a role in normalizing refugee issues in states' domestic policy and in international policy. So I was really just curious if they would be involved in these discussions and if they would be commenting on R2P. And what I found is that in the earliest framings of R2P up to the 2005 World Summit, they really weren't that involved in discussions. And a lot of that, I theorize that part of that is because they were expanding their mandate from just a focus on refugees to also internally displaced persons who didn't have a particular founding document that guided their protection. So at that time, they were appealing for a lot of funding from states, and they rely on states' consent to enter and conduct protection missions. So I theorized that perhaps they weren't as involved in these discussions because they were concerned about their reputation. But in later discussions, they did become quite involved, and they even advocated for the mention of refugee protection in the implementing responsibility to protect report in 2009, which is a pretty big victory.
I do have a question here.
Thank you for sharing your research. My question is for Annette. I'm wondering for your research, why did you choose the time frames you selected, and why did you specifically look at newspaper editorials as opposed to, say, like leaders' public statements or something? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so for the time frames, you might have noticed that one was bigger than the other. So the first one was 1995 to 2003, and then the second one was just 2018 to 2020. So the first one was chosen because even though the employment permit system passed in 2003, there were several attempts to pass it leading up to that, and so a lot of discussion. So I wanted to capture that period. As for the 2018 to 2020, 2018 was when the Yemeni refugees arrived, and there was a huge political hubbub about it. And I cut it off at 2020 because the government by then was increasingly quietly trying to make these reforms to refugee policies, and it was becoming less and less like big news, like much fewer people were aware that it was even happening. And also the pandemic sort of shut down / distracted from these discussions for a while. Like when I was going through and cleaning up the data the text that I was looking at, I had to exclude so many articles from 2020 because they might mention foreigners, but it was really just about like COVID policies and whether you should wear a mask and things like that. So there wasn't a lot of useful data from that point. And then for the newspaper editorials, I will say that ideally, if I really wanted to get how people felt about immigration and societal belonging, I would want to go to like internet cafes and forums and comment sections, but that's quite difficult to aggregate and scrape like a significant amount of. So I decided to look at newspapers, and I specifically chose editorials because I didn't want like just reporting. I wanted to see what kinds of opinions people were expressing.
Well, I think I'd like to congratulate these 3 students again for their outstanding work and for spending a year in the honors program here at the Watson Institute. I think we all learned a lot today, and I think there's a lot to continue. There are a lot of compelling ideas that have come out of these presentations. So congratulations again, and I think it's now time to transition to panel 3. And applause.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ed Steinfeld, the director of the Watson Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you back to our panel on In the Shadow of Hegemons. I'm just going to do very brief introductions, and then we'll plunge right into the presentations. So first, we'll have Catherine Nelly, who will be presenting on her thesis, Between Empire and Post-Colonial Nation Building, a comparative analysis of nationalism's role in French India's decolonization in Chandernagore and Pondicherry. Then we'll have Isabella Yepes, who will be presenting on her thesis, Disaggregating the Quality of Democracy, Evaluating the Effects of U.S. Counterterrorism Aid on the Quality of Democracy in Colombia. And then we'll have Megan Murphy, who will be presenting on No One Can Replace China, Cambodia's alignment with China since Hun Sen's 1997 coup. Great. Catherine, the floor is yours.
All right. So, the story of anti-colonialism in India is understandably discussed in terms of Britain, the dominant colonial power on the subcontinent. However, France and Portugal also held small territories in India, and they remained colonial strongholds even after India and Pakistan gained independence from Britain in 1947. My thesis examines the role of nationalism in the decolonization processes of two French Indian settlements, Chandanagar and Pondicherry, to explain why there was one unionist voice in Chandanagar and multiple discordant voices in Pondicherry over whether to merge with India post-1947. French India consisted of 5 small comptoirs, 4 of which remained French colonial territories until 1954. While generally understood to be unimportant anomalies in the French Empire, examining the small, quote, sleepy outposts, unquote, of French India can reveal new insights about the varying role of nationalism across different parts of India, as well as the constraints which India and France considered when making geopolitical and foreign policy decisions in the mid-20th century. Post-1947, the French government agreed to allow its Indian territories to hold referendums over whether they would join India. There was a stark divergence between Chandanagar and Pondicherry in their processes of unification. Chandanagar held a referendum in 1949 and overwhelmingly voted to join the Indian Union based on strong, at times militant support of the Indian state in line with Bengali nationalism. Pondicherry never held a referendum. It was the site of vocal pro- and anti-merger movements, and after years of tense disputes, the French signed it over to India without a referendum in 1954. So, in light of the stark differences in decolonial processes between these two seemingly similar French territories, I ask why there were multiple local voices and differing opinions about merging with India in Pondicherry, but one militantly unionist voice in Chandanagar. Through a comparative historical analysis based on archival materials from France and Britain, I argue that in Chandanagar, sustained revolutionary activity throughout the mid-20th century allowed for extensive integration with Bengali nationalists seeking independence from Britain, through which strong regional nationalism evolved. This nationalist regional identity caused an overwhelmingly unionist voice in Chandanagar, leading to a quick merger with India once the British departed. West Bengal was home to a particularly militant form of Indian nationalism, which was sparked by the 1905 partition of Bengal into West Bengal and East Bengal. Chandanagar, embedded in West Bengal, was influenced by this particularly militant Bengali nationalism and was a refuge to militant anti-British revolutionaries escaping British colonial penalties. Both British Indian Bengali nationalists and French Indian Bengali nationalists engaged in revolutionary activity in Chandanagar. And once India gained independence, the people of Chandanagar turned their attention to the colonial governance of the French and sought unification with the rest of India. A strong identity across colonial borders never developed in Pondicherry, where a high level of French administration caused a Franco-Tamilian culture to flourish before the Indian independence movement ever began. The lack of a shared subnationalist identity across Pondicherry and Madras led to an absence of sustained revolutionary activity, precluding the widespread development of Indian nationalism in Pondicherry, and leaving space for other factors, like economics, French cultural ties, or the power politics by local elites, to take on greater significance. This resulted in multiple voices for and against merger with India, voices which stayed divided throughout the withdrawal of French presence. In contrast to the unique influence of Bengali nationalism on Chandanagar, Pondicherry was not surrounded by a hotbed of militant nationalist activity, and therefore was not a refuge for such militant revolutionaries to operate out of. Even one of the most prominent militant revolutionaries, Aurobindo Ghosh, did not take refuge in Pondicherry to plot attacks against the British, but rather to essentially retire. Even though Pondicherry was located in the Madras Presidency, which saw a strong subnationalist movement that at times put forth secessionist demands for an independent Tamil state, there was a lack of sustained Pondicherrian engagement in Madras's subnationalist movement in the 20th century, which I argue was caused by the lack of an integrated Tamil identity across colonial borders. While Bengali nationalism played a key role in Chandanagar's decision to merge with India after 1947, Tamil nationalism did not have a significant effect on the merger debates in Pondicherry. I'll highlight just a few points of both of the case studies, beginning with Chandanagar. British government sources detail at length the danger Chandanagar posed to colonial India. One British memorandum from 1914 states, "It will be seen that Chandanagar, only 20 miles from Calcutta, the capital of British India, has now become the center of the chief and most dangerous anarchical conspiracy in India." An attached secret note explicitly describes the revolutionary Bengali identity in Chandanagar, stating that, quote, there is evidence that Chandanagar was infected with the spirit of disaffection, which spread over Bengal in 1907, end quote. After India gained independence from Britain in 1947, France was amenable to working with the new Indian state, while at the same time being reluctant to relinquish power. However, Bengali nationalism in Chandanagar overrode French imperial power to expedite the territory's accession to India through an overwhelmingly unanimous unionist voice. In September of 1946, a French official emphasized the precarity of the French position in Chandanagar, stating that, quote, Chandanagar is by far the most difficult dependent territory to administrate and possibly the most difficult position of all of the French Union, with the exclusion of Indochina, end quote, in my translation. This is an astonishing admission when put in context. In 1946, France-controlled territories including Algeria, Morocco, large swaths of Western and Central Africa, the West Indies, and French Guinea. To claim that Chandanagar, a territory of merely 4 square miles, was the most difficult to administrate, and that it was second only to French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, where a war was breaking out, in terms of the delicacy of the political situation, reveals the strength of the nationalist movement in Chandanagar and France's inability to counter it. An outbreak of violence in Chandanagar in 1947 led France to grant its Indian settlements local autonomy, but this was an inefficient solution in Chandanagar. France acquiesced to holding a referendum in 1949 to determine the future of the settlement, and Chandanagar voted overwhelmingly to merge with the Indian Union. In Pondicherry, there was never the same level of revolutionary activity. A 1934 report documents that, quote, Pondicherry has been to a slight extent a city of refuge for British Indian malcontents, e.g. Aurobindo Ghosh, who was at one time a leading seditionist. But his interest in politics faded, and the territory, unlike Chandanagar, has never become a base for revolutionary plots, end quote. Due to a divergent identity, and in the absence of a regionally specific development of Indian nationalism across colonial borders, a combination of other factors, economic, cultural, and political, influenced the course of events in Pondicherry after 1947. The Socialist Party massively benefited from a flourishing smuggling business in Pondicherry, and the party leader, M.M. Goubert, benefited from holding power over a small territory, a power that would be lost if Pondicherry were subsumed into the massive Indian nation-state. The Socialist Party is believed to have rigged the municipal council elections, in which they won all of the seats, and is said to have intimidated voters, which gave India cause to delay referenda. People in Pondicherry were also influenced by economic considerations. Pondicherry was home to a strong textile industry, which would be damaged in a merger by the loss of French overseas markets, and by the differing business laws in the Indian Union. However, India was intent on expelling foreign power from the subcontinent, and the Indian government forced an economic blockade on Pondicherry, which in 1954 changed the tide of opinion. The smuggling business became less profitable, and the Socialist and Communist Party leaders now saw a merger as inevitable and wanted to maintain their power in that outcome. Their demonstrations for a merger without referendum began in earnest, aided by alleged Indian interference. France tried to avoid a merger without referendum, not only because it was required by the French Constitution, but also because it would set a precedent for independence movements in other parts of the French Empire. India's Prime Minister, Nehru, refused to hold a popular vote because, quote, he does not want to set a precedent for plebiscites in other disputed areas, e.g. Kashmir and Portuguese Goa, where the vote might go against India. In earlier years, India delayed a referendum in Pondicherry because it knew France would win, yet even when it would likely go in India's favor, Nehru refused a referendum. After the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan, it appears that India's strategy for unifying the dozens of states and principalities was to ensure that the people in those places could not have the chance to choose separatism for one unified nation-state. While France eventually acquiesced to the pressure and did hand over its South Indian settlements without a referendum in 1954, pro-French protests in 1954 demonstrate that the calls for merger were never unanimous. Dozens of groups and associations vociferously declared their loyalty to France and their desire to stay in the French Union. In 1962, Stephen Barber wrote in the Daily Telegraph that France had peacefully turned over its territories in India as, quote, sleepy relics of a steamboat era when Indochina was abandoned, end quote. This became the common paradigm through which French India was understood. As we have seen, however, the decolonization of French India was not a simple handoff. Militant unionism in Chandrinagar caused the French to declare it the second most delicate political situation of the entire empire, and Pondicherry became a battleground for the Indian and French governments, both of which had much to lose by the precedents that could be set in acquiescing to the other states' terms. The French pulled out of Indochina in August of 1954, and just a few months later ceded the remaining Indian settlements to India without a referendum. In 1954, the Communist Party was in control of Pondicherry and engaging in increasingly militant demonstrations. And while in previous years India had avoided military interventions into French India, 1954 saw an increase in Indian pressure on the French settlements and aid to pro-merger protesters and agitators. It's not unreasonable for France to have been worried about another military conflict over its colonial territories. And with tensions high, France chose to peacefully relinquish its Indian territories, indicating a French consideration of the Cold War fallout over Franco-Indian relations that decisions over its overseas empire could cause. In addition, examining India's refusal to allow a plebiscite in Pondicherry in light of their tenuous position in Kashmir reveals an insight into why pan-Indian nationalism won out over the possible separations that could have occurred in post-partition India. Unless the Indian government knew it would squarely win, it delayed offering popular votes, and even when an outcome would be to their favor, they avoided setting the precedent of a vote through which people could choose to leave, or never join, the Indian Union. My thesis demonstrates that studying French colonialism in India can reveal implications about the conditions which contribute to nationalist movements across colonial borders, France's broader imperial and Cold War considerations, and India's challenges in post-colonial, post-partition nation building. Thank you so much, and thank you to my advisors, Prerna Singh and Ashutosh Varshni, and to Tony Levitas, who is my seminar advisor.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to be presenting on my thesis, Disaggregating the Quality of Democracy, Evaluating the Effects of Counterterrorism Aid on the Quality of Democracy in Colombia from 2000 to 2010. I'll share a brief anecdote. My interest in the topic stemmed from my family's background. In Colombia, the conflict between the Colombian government and the FARC has been the backdrop through which my family's history is viewed, and the lens through which they view their own past. I wanted to interrogate this backdrop. I wanted to ask what the actual implications of what the war and the conflict meant for the people of Colombia and how the United States played a role. But beyond any single case, beyond Colombia, the relationship between democracy assistance as an aspect of foreign aid, counterterrorism, and the quality of democracy presents a much larger research puzzle. The effects of and relative success of each is widely debated, not least of which in this thesis, and despite their wide employment by any number of countries, including the United States, it continues to be a very controversial topic. In particular, democracy assistance experienced a watershed moment in 2001 when countering terror and promoting democracy came to be seen as synonymous, particularly in the Middle East. They became intrinsically connected policy priorities for the United States. And yet, once again, their nexus, this combination of democracy assistance, foreign aid, and counterterrorism has not really been understood in the literature and what the effects are beyond broadly democracy. So when faced with this big picture, I asked, to what extent does democracy assistance, when compounded by counterterrorism programs, affect the quality of democracy? And as it applied to Colombia, to what extent did the democracy assistance foreign aid package, Plan Colombia, affect, when combined with counterterrorism policies after 9/11, affect the quality of democracy from 2000 to 2010? In order to answer this question, I looked specifically at the rule of law as an aggregate measure or component of the quality of democracy in order to capture the more specific effects on the ground. In terms of significance, here, like I did in the thesis, I'll divide it into theoretical and practical. On the theoretical level, existing research on the topic has, as I said, not really fully examined the combination of democracy assistance, counterterrorism, and the quality of democracy. And the majority of the research on the effects of democracy assistance are large and quantitative analyses, with democracy as a dependent variable. Similarly, the research on counterterrorism has also dealt with democracy more broadly. Both fields then have ignored the quality of democracy as a variable of which to study. This gap is critical because without a measure of the quality of democracy, it is difficult to observe fluctuations in pre-existing democracy as a result of these policies that I've studied, beyond just looking at transitioning between regime type. For instance, it's difficult to capture nuances in the certain aspects on the ground that quality of democracy captures, such as freedom, inequality, and as I studied here, the rule of law. Additionally, there is no consensus in the literature on the effects of any of these policies, which once again makes it a valuable place to study and look at when there's so much controversy on the relative successes of each. On a practical level, it's important to understand the consequences of these policies because they are still used. The United States has recently increased its foreign aid obligations since the past fiscal year. The prospect of democratic backsliding, while a controversial topic, is a real concern that has drawn requests to revisit democracy assistance. And counterterrorism, while perhaps most infamously employed during the Bush administration, has continued. I'll discuss my research design. I selected Colombia because during the time frame, it was a country engaged in a long-standing civil conflict with multiple organizations termed terrorist organizations by the United States, including the AUC, the ELN, and the FARC. Additionally, it was a recipient of democracy assistance, coupled with counterterrorism objectives from the US, and it received more aid than any country in Latin America and any country in the world besides, give or take, 3 or 4. I consider Colombia to be a least likely to case for this period of analysis. In other words, if my thesis, that democracy assistance, when combined with counterterrorism, ultimately harms the quality of democracy, works in Colombia, which is an already democratic state with pre-existing and strong democratic institutions that willingly cooperated with foreign aid, then I expect it to work in countries experiencing lower levels of democracy with greater instability. In terms of sources, I use both quantitative and qualitative. I have outlined some on the page. While quantitative indices are helpful in judging the overall trajectory of democratization, they can be overly broad and miss variables if used exclusively. For instance, Freedom House has not consistently measured rule of law with a numeric variable, and VDEM's definition of the rule of law does not include a measure of the illegitimate use of force, which is a critical aspect of rule of law as I define it. And for qualitative evidence, as you see here, I used a variety of firsthand accounts, including communications between the Department of Defense and Department of State, as well as secondhand reports and NGO reports. In terms of time frame, as I mentioned, I began in 2000. I use this time frame because it provides the ability to see how aid changed after the introduction of a counterterrorism component post 9/11 for fiscal year 2002, and how it changed again after counterterrorism and security aid was deprioritized after 2008. So about a 2-year gap at the beginning and at the end to see how it changed before 2002 and how it changed after. My findings. Using these research methods, I found that during the time frame, U.S. democracy assistance negatively affected the rule of law in Colombia, which in turn negatively affected the quality of democracy. In my thesis, I identify 7 aspects of the rule of law. Of these 7, the research was particularly rich as it dealt with the second aspect, which states that under the rule of law, no area is dominated by organized crime, there is no corruption, and the 7th, which states that under the rule of law, everyone has protection from the illegitimate use of force. On the second, I found that the FARC's control over Colombia decreased during the time frame, which is ostensibly a good thing, and that security consequently increased. However, I did not find substantial evidence that the U.S. aid was determinative or played a causal role in the process. With respect to the illegitimate use of force, here I did find evidence that U.S. aid ultimately led to an increase in the use of force, thereby decreasing the rule of law. I'll outline some of the points I had under that. There is a consensus among both Colombian and U.S. sources that cases of the illegitimate use of force, or the numbers of extrajudicial executions, instances of torture, and other instances of the illegitimate use of force increased after 2002 and peaked in 2007, then decreasing after 2008. This already on its head shows a correlation. However, I kept looking and found that beginning in 2002, the United States was aware of the instances of the illegitimate use of force. Multiple NGOs and Colombian citizens had brought these cases to the U.S. consulate, but they were largely ignored. So communications did show that there was an awareness, but aid continued and increased to the military. Testimony from former officers has alleged that they often committed extrajudicial executions due to pressure from higher-ups. These higher-ups in the military, in turn, were demanding a higher body count as a measure of success. In one instance, General Montoya demanded liters of blood. This was how they were measuring success in the War on Terror. And this rhetoric mimicked, and as evidence shows, was influenced by the United States' policy priorities. Then Minister of Defense Santos, he would later become president, called the body count mentality Plan Colombia's original sin. Additionally, under Plan Colombia, confidential expenses, which were used to pay those who committed these extrajudicial executions, increased as a part of the aid given. And finally, and perhaps most critically, when U.S. aid increased per battalion, the number of extrajudicial executions also increased. Additionally, when the number of Colombian soldiers trained by the United States increased per battalion, so too did the number of extrajudicial executions. Here, I had help from a friend graphing on R, and you can see that per year, as this aid increased, so too did the killings. So in sum, I asked what this all meant. Primarily, I think that I predict a spillover effect on military aid in the region. The United States gives military aid and expects the militaries to model themselves after the United States. This in turn leads to the Colombian military, which has now been influenced by U.S. body count mentality, giving aid to other countries in Latin America, and increasing a possibility of other militaries learning from the mistakes of the Colombian military. Additionally, I suggest that democratic regimes can withstand a decline in the quality of democracy. While there was a decline in the quality of democracy as I measured it by looking at the rule of law during this time period, Colombia remained a democracy, which suggests that there was a resiliency in democratic institutions that can withstand a decline in other areas. However, how this occurred in Colombia and why it occurred is perhaps another avenue for future research. Additionally, in terms of policy, I would suggest, based on this thesis, reframing the body count mentality and revisiting the vetting process. Both of these policy aspects, if changed during Plan Colombia, could have made a substantial difference in preventing the illegitimate use of force. Just simply by rhetorically reframing it and then revisiting and reapplying the Lehigh Amendment could have prevented many of these instances. Finally, I suggest that security is not inherently democratic. While the security in Colombia improved during this time period, the country did not necessarily become more democratic, and its quality did not necessarily improve. And in short, that means that democracy assistance does not always assist the quality of democracy. If our intention is truly to assist democracy, then we must revisit the ways in which we do so and ask if counterterrorism policies really are harmonious with democracy. Thank you so much.
Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Dajahao to my Chinese-speaking friends in the room, and Chumripsua to my friends and family watching in Cambodia, which is actually nobody because it's 3 a.m. right now. My name is Megan Murphy, and I'm an international relations concentrator. And today I'm presenting on my thesis exploring the causative factors behind Cambodia's decision to align with China since 1997. In doing so, I'll speak to the factors influencing the decision-making patterns of leaders in small states. I've lived in 3 countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand, and I was especially interested to see how China has gained influence in Cambodia in the past several decades. But my interest really sparked in this topic when I learned about the 2012 Association of Southeast Asian Nations Crisis, or ASEAN Crisis, which was when Cambodia sided with Beijing on the issue of the South China Sea, placing it against old allies of the Cambodian regime, such as Vietnam and other ASEAN states, such as the Philippines. Cambodia's refusal to agree with other Southeast Asian states resulted in the association failing to issue a joint communique for the first time in its history. And at this point, policymakers in the U.S. began deeming Cambodia as lost to China. My thesis emerged from myself asking why Cambodia chose this relationship or alliance with China, risking its international reputation, relationship with other Southeast Asian nations, and relationship with the United States. As I was leading into this thesis, I realized a lack of literature concerning how small states make decisions in the context of hegemonic competition, in this case, looking at the context of US-China competition. The prevailing theory of realism in IR argues that power is the most important factor in determining international relations, and the bulk of the literature examining relationships between major and small states focuses on the decision-making processes of the larger and more powerful states. However, my thesis seeks to challenge the historic scholarly consensus that small state foreign policy is best explained by the actions of more powerful states or by structural systematic factors and not domestic issues within the small states. I question why it is that small states in similar environments act in very different ways. And specifically, why would a weak state choose alignment with one major power and antagonism with another instead of remaining in the middle and pursuing positive relations with both states? As this diagram shows, many countries in this same region are choosing a more balanced approach or are choosing a relationship with the U.S. So I'm asking why it is Cambodia pursued this relationship with China. I situate my analysis at the domestic or regime level, so I'm looking at Hun Sen, who has been prime minister since the coup in 1997, and his Cambodian People's Party, also referred to as the CPP. So therefore, the broad question is what factors explain a small state's foreign policy decision to align with a major power. But my more specific question that I look at in this thesis is examining Cambodia's increasing level of bilateral cooperation with China in the period between 1997 and 2022. In this thesis, I utilize path dependency, so I track the development of policy over time. I begin with antecedent historical conditions, beginning long before this change is observed. So I start in 1990, which is when Cambodia emerged from decades of civil war and genocide and gained sovereignty from Vietnam and began setting up democratic institutions. At this time, China and Cambodia had a terrible relationship. Chinese leadership called Hun Sen, then a politician, a Vietnamese puppet. Hun Sen called China, quote, the root of all that was evil in Cambodia. Then I identify a critical juncture in 1997 as the coup d'etat, when the CPP used violence and military posturing to oust the Prime Minister Norodom Sihanouk and change the trajectory of foreign policy. I end the timeline in 2022, which is when my data pretty much concludes, but was also another year in which Cambodia hosted ASEAN. My hypothesis is that in this thesis, and thus my argument, is that the relationship blossomed because Hun Sen and the ruling Cambodian People's Party faced crises of regime survival and legitimacy following the coup, and therefore turned to China as a benefactor that would not challenge their authoritarian rule. I've already gone over the theoretical significance of focusing on how small states respond to these issues, but the real interest in my thesis contributes to the narrative surrounding China's global power and America's waning influence in Asia, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In the West, there's a narrative that China is forcing itself on other countries and overtly promoting autocracy by exporting its own model of authoritarianism onto neighboring states. There's this argument that China is consciously supporting these autocratic regimes and preventing the spread of Western democracy. In Asia, there is also a narrative that the United States itself is trying to institute regime change and color revolutions. And many Cambodians in politics have argued that the United States is the cause behind its own fraying relations between the U.S. and Cambodia. But my question asks about the internal decisions within this country, not looking at either China or the United States as puppeteers behind policies in Cambodia, but what choices the leaders in that country made. So my research design needed to establish three main things. First, to establish a shift in the Cambodia-China relationship with quantitative data and to map the change on the timeline to prove that it increased. Two, to establish a decline in Cambodia's democracy levels to test my hypothesis that the relationship with China was tied to domestic politics, and finally to tie this slide to authoritarianism with Cambodia's foreign politics. So on the first, this involved tracking the shift on three components of the bilateral relationship. First, the economic. I looked at trade levels between China and Cambodia since the 1990s, as well as aid from China to Cambodia including Belt and Road infrastructure projects within Cambodia, and finally looked at bilateral debt from Cambodia to China. On the military front, I looked at arms trade, joint military exercises, and bases being built by China in Cambodia. And finally, for the diplomatic front, I created a database tracking visits between leaders between Cambodia and China, as well as looking at foreign policy stances of Cambodian officials on issues of interest to China, such as the South China Sea and Hong Kong. Secondly, I looked at the Varieties of Democracy Project, VDEM, for quantitative levels of Cambodian democracy from 1990 to 2022, and then combed through thousands of news articles from Asian and American sources, coding each in a positive or negative developments in the relationship and searching for keywords to describe the relationship between China, Cambodia, and the United States. So now on to my findings. On democracy, it was pretty bad. We saw decreases in electoral and deliberative democracy following the Cree juncture in 1997, as well as following the election years within Cambodia in 2013 and 2018. What I saw was a slide towards hegemonic authoritarianism, in which the Cambodian People's Party further outlawed opposition parties, curtailed freedoms, and limited freedom of the press, and then showed the CPP action in doing so. On the shift in the relationship, I saw upticks in aid and development projects and diplomatic visits right after 1997 between Cambodia and China, seeing, for example, that Cambodia becomes the #1 recipient of Belt and Road infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, at the same time, my history chapter showed that after 1997, the U.S. and West placed sanctions on Cambodia and halted development projects within Cambodia. Therefore, I make the case that Cambodia started to use Chinese aid to scale up patronage-based development projects and maintain legitimacy for the CPP's non-democratic regime. My findings on why the relationship between Cambodia and China emerged show push and pull factors. The United States and the West largely pushed Cambodia away after the 1997 coup, placing sanctions on the country, limiting assistance, making criticisms of the lack of democracy in the press, but China did not criticize the coup and further pulled Cambodia in with Belt and Road Initiative aid that started in 2013. My argument is that when Hun Sen and the CPP committed to single-party rule, they decided to go all in on a relationship with China, seeing they would not receive criticism from that angle. What I found on autocracy and democracy promotion from newspaper analysis revealed that allegations emerged around 2013 from within Cambodia that the U.S. was trying to foment a color revolution. And this shows that Cambodian leaders are coming to see the United States as a threat to their rule, in contrast to China as one that prolongs their rule. However, I found no evidence of this so-called color revolution taking place. Throughout my paper, using sources to describe the process by which the 1997 coup took place, I also found no evidence of a Chinese attempt to back or foment a coup or export autocratic regimes within Cambodia. I argue instead of being a causative factor, China's engagement is an enabling factor for the CPP, as its aid does help mitigate the economic and diplomatic fallout of the liberal international stage from Cambodia's slide towards hegemonic authoritarianism. Thus, my thesis takes the stance that China's impact on autocracy is unintentional. It is more that China is willing, unlike liberal regimes, to provide autocratic leadership with support than purposefully intervening in states to force authoritarian outcomes. Before I go on to my final slide, I'd like to give some thank yous to my advisor, Professor Jost, my first user, Professor Kinzer, Claudia Elliott, who led our thesis course, my class of thesis writers, and especially to Isabella, my roommate and my best friend, as well as all of my friends who have come to see this presentation today. Finally, the implications. I'll first acknowledge this is a picture of myself and Hun Sen, where I was telling him about the outcomes of my thesis and that he should give up rule and go back to democracy. Okay, not really. Also, my roommate pointed out that I'm wearing the same shirt in this picture as I am today. I have no other outfits. But the real implications. On regime survival and agency, what I've shown is that while realist theory and its offshoots would argue that the desires of the larger and more powerful state determine the path of interstate relations, I instead argue that Cambodian policymakers, Hun Sen namely, independently chose, based on domestic considerations, to pursue authoritarianism, independent of China, although the relationship with China emerged as a result. Implications for the perception of the United States in Asia include that Cambodia and other countries see the U.S. as a threat and perceives them as abandoning them or forcing them to choose between the U.S. and China. An answer might be that improved relations in Asia might require forgoing hard and fast pro-democracy stances or abandoning hard and fast sanctions on countries when they slide away from liberal democratic norms. Moreover, the allegations of color revolutions and regime change, although without evidence, reveal animosities from the Cold War era that have not been adequately addressed by the U.S. and Asia. On why China? Well, what my argument is that China may not be exporting a model of authoritarianism or intentionally strengthening particular regimes, but it is passively aiding authoritarian states through BRI policies, increasing economic ties, and diplomatic support for authoritarian regimes. I argue that China has this impact because they're actually a last resort. Authoritarian regimes are only really able to seek out Chinese aid when they're faced with limited access to Western aid and markets. As Hun Sen remarked in the past year, who can I rely on if not for China? If it were not for China's help, who would have built these bridges? Who can replace China? No one can replace China. So my conclusion is that Cambodia wasn't overtaken by China and isn't just a domino that has fallen in the new Cold War between the US and China. This narrative, I argue, is inherently confrontational. But more than a vassal state of China, Hun Sen and his regime signed on to this cooperation as a self-sustaining mechanism, and any approaches should take these domestic considerations and the agency of small state leaders into account. Thank you so much.
Megan, and thanks to all the presenters. We have some time for Q&A. Any questions for the panel? Stephen?
Gotta wait for the screen to go.
Like a marker.
So I've got a question for the two roommates, if I could. They both have to do with the role of individuals, which is a role that in our business we're trained to de-emphasize, but actually does play a significant role. So first of all, in Cambodia, we have a government that's been dominated by one person for more than 20 years. During that period, Cambodia has taken the path that you've very brilliantly laid out. So at some point, he's going to be gone. Your presentation seemed to suggest that this was something that was deeply ingrained, the China relationship. Will the passing or disappearance of Hun Sen lead to a change in this relationship, or is the relationship widely accepted and embraced among Cambodians or among the important factions in Cambodian politics? And for Isabella, my question is also about another individual. You covered an entire period when Colombia was governed by a whole series of presidents, all of the same ideological bent. In fact, that's been all Colombia's had. Ever since the US has been involved with Colombia, Colombian presidents have embraced American aid and been very pro-American. Suddenly, this just changed. It's in the period after you end your study. What does that mean for everything that you've pointed out? Is there going to be a dramatic change in US-Colombian relations? And what will that mean, not only for counterterrorism, but more important, because of your thesis, to democracy?
Okay, I can go first. So on the topic of, yes, Hun Sen is on his way out. He is one of the longest serving prime ministers, heads of state in the world, but he is priming his son, Hun Manet, to take over, who currently leads the army. So it really depends on whether that transition is successful or not. China's pretty unpopular in Cambodia. The infrastructure projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, although they've been successful in building bridges, more buildings, casinos in Sihanoukville, for example, they've had a lot of environmental consequences. Many individuals have lost their land to Chinese development projects. So they're not the most popular amongst people, but most people don't really have a choice in selecting their leaders. In 2018, Hun Sen's party got rid of the lead opposition party, and this past year has jailed the opposition leader, as well as forcing other opposition leaders out of the country, and his son, Hun Manet, seems to be the only individual who will likely take over. In that case, I think the relationship with China will continue, unless there are broader shifts in the governing coalition.
Yeah, and on the topic or on part of Colombia, I would say that it is difficult to predict what the relationship between Colombia and the United States will look like in the coming few years. Petro, for context, for those who don't know, is the first leftist elected in Colombia in a very, very long time, and has on many occasions criticized various aspects of U.S. policy. He's also a former guerrilla himself. However, what I would say is that while Colombia still receives a great deal of U.S. aid, counterterrorism aid is at this point, in my opinion, less relevant post-2016 in the peace accords. Though I do think that armed groups continue to present a threat, I think that the relationship between the United States and Colombia is not so frayed that aid would not continue should a remobilization pose a larger threat to the state. So I guess, in short, what I'm saying is that while I do think Petro has distanced himself from the policies of his predecessors, I don't see a relationship change between the United States and Colombia to be in the near future so dramatic that it would affect the level of aid going to Colombia.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Question for all three panelists. For Catherine, surely there were other economic, personal, political interests for the people in Chandranagore. Did nationalism solely kind of win out and mute those factors? Or were there other forces at play? For Isabella, and this is more of a clarifying question because I'm not familiar with the subject. Was the body count metric made solely by the U.S. and was enforced in other states as well as a metric that came with this counterterrorism aid? And if so, how was it developed? And for Megan, was there any evidence that China maybe tried to influence or sway Cambodian elite, or at least the political elite, over to China's side, either during, before, or in the moments after the coup? Or did it solely seem like it was a Cambodian choice?
Thank you so much for your question. So in Chandranagore, there were three major political parties: the National Democratic Front, the Communist Party, and the United Parties. And all three were intent on merger with India. The National Democratic Front was willing to listen to West Bengal and sort of step away from inciting violence to get an immediate merger. But the other two were inciting violence and hoping for a merger. There was a 98.5% vote to merge with the Indian Union, which is a very different outcome than in Pondicherry, where two of the major political parties were staunchly against the merger with India and subverted democratic practices to decide the future of the territory. And in Chandranagore, there was a much less, less of a presence of administration, and the outsized influence of the sustained engagement in revolutionary activity meant that when it came to the time when India gained its independence, that carried over into revolutionary activity against the French.
Yes, yeah. I would say in terms of what body count metric means, it's an unofficial and informal term to describe the prioritization of the number of dead in terms of military success. I've encountered it in other literature. However, like as I said, it's not an official term. And in terms of where it stems from, literature suggests, and this is also stemming from a direct quote from President Santos, that in his perspective, it comes from an ingrained Vietnam War mentality of the number of deaths being the way you measure success. So it's not exclusive to Colombia, but simultaneously, it's not a official or formal term.
Yeah, so in my research, I did not find that China swayed the elite prior to 1997, which has to do a lot about like Vietnam War lore, what we would call history. Basically, China and Vietnam had gone to war against each other following the Vietnam War over Cambodia and over control of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. And one of those individuals that was actually fighting China on the side of Vietnam was Hun Sen. So China was never overtly supportive of his party, and they actually were supportive of the opposition party that Hun Sen ended up taking out in the coup. But right after the coup, we saw an increase in visits between Chinese leaders and Cambodian leaders, and what came from that was a partnership that emerged quite quickly. So after one visit of the Chinese leadership to Cambodia, like the day after, Hun Sen announced that Cambodia would no longer support Taiwan and would be closing the Taiwanese offices within Cambodia. And since then, some of the money through BRI aid or support from the military has been traced to trickling down to elites that are supportive of Hun Sen. So definitely that support for the regime has been seen since, but not before the coup.
Thank you all. Fantastic work.
Catherine, in your examination of French archives on France's Indian territories, you say you did find references to a comparison with Indochina. And we know that Indochina basically around 1950 was when France withdrew from Indochina, but after a fight, right? Did you find in your archival materials in the south of France where you went any reference to Algeria? Why did France want to leave Pondicherry but hold on to Algeria, which also had a war, and Algeria got independence? This was a serious war between France and the nationalist forces. And Algeria got independence only in 1962.
Thank you for your question. So it's interesting, the archival sources that I examined don't make explicit reference to Algeria. They make explicit reference to Indochina, which I think was influencing their initial decisions to try to hold on to the territories in South India. But I think that at the end of the sort of French reign over its French Indian settlements, Algeria played a role in what they were trying to do, because they had already lost Indochina, but they refused for as long as they could to relinquish the South Indian territories without a referendum, because doing this would give fuel to the independence movement that was breaking out in Algeria. But I think that ultimately, the considerations of the Franco-Indian relations at the sort of in the mid-1950s meant that France knew that it had to relinquish its territories to India or it would face military intervention, which turned out to be true, given that in 1961, India invaded Portuguese Goa when Portugal refused to give up Goa to India. So I think it was Algeria sort of played an influence, played a role in France's considerations of the geopolitical ramifications of holding on to or giving up French India, but the considerations of the relationships between France and a new major global player of India won out.
Great. Other questions? Tony?
Yeah, I have another question for Catherine, which is, you say in '54 the Indians didn't want to have a plebiscite because they were nervous about what might happen in Goa or Kashmir. Why then did they agree in '48 or push for it? And in some ways, it seems like it would have been convenient for both sides just to have given it away without having gone through the ritual of the plebiscite, when everybody knew what the result was going to be precisely for the reasons that you've given it. So what's going on?
Yeah.
And can I just tag on another question so you can do it all at once?
Mhm.
So I was curious about Tranquebar. You know, like you've spoken about French outposts, and I love the idea that you're kind of problematizing at the kind of singular idea of English, British colonialism. But Tranquebar was a Dutch outpost, along with a few others. And so I'm just wondering, like, you know, it just, you know, you ended with this idea of these sleepy outposts that are considered insignificant and forgotten. And so just kind of push you further in terms of breaking open the kind of uniform narrative of British colonialism, to tell us if you know anything about that case and decisions to join or not join India.
Thank you both. I'll start with Professor Levitas's question. So British sources from the British Library and the UK National Archives actually reference how India put itself in a bind when it was demanding the referendums, because at that point, France was willing to work with India, sort of seeing the way that how things were likely to play out after the British left. But France was actually hoping to hold on to 2 or 3 of its colonial territories in India. And it was against the French Constitution to not have sort of the voice of the people deciding whether to leave the French Union. And so I think that this, the plebiscite was sort of decided on as a solution to this issue in 47 and 48, but the French interference in Pondicherry was cited by the Indian government as a reason to not have a plebiscite there, because they were worried that this sort of rigging of elections by the Socialist Party and by the French Empire would alter the outcome of the election. And then it became an issue that even if they were to win a plebiscite, that would open up an avenue for other places, because at British independence in 1947, the unification of India wasn't a done deal. There were hundreds of princely states and territories that had differing sort of inclinations as to how much they wanted to be a part of the Indian Union. And so this played a really big role in India's considerations of how to get France out of India. I don't actually know much about the Dutch outposts. And so that's something the further avenues of research that I'd be interested in is not only comparing the French cases to the Portuguese case, which has a very different outcome that was taken to the UN, but also the other sort of smaller colonial territories in India, and how looking at the different colonial variations in India gave rise to differing identities and understandings of people's relationship to the nation state.
Great. Claudia.
Thank you. What a wonderful and powerful set of presentations. I have, for our previous panels, we've asked kind of a reflective question. So I'd like to ask something similar to the three of you. What was the most important thing you learned about the process of writing a thesis? Not about the substance, not about the theory, not about the case study, but about the process itself that you think you will take with you after you leave Brown?
Megan, should we start your side of the table?
Well, that would be how to use a computer. I definitely struggled a lot not having as much of a quantitative or like computer science basis in my thesis, but learned how valuable using R can be. I worked with my advisor, Professor Jost, on extracting a lot of data sets, making sure that they were represented in a way that reflected my conclusions. And I think what I took the most from this was incorporating that level of analysis that, coming from an IR background, I didn't know as much. So that's about the process of this thesis that I learned the most, that I didn't have experience with before.
Oh my gosh, I'd echo that. And I'd also add that I learned how difficult it would be about setting a realistic timetable or schedule for the thesis. Thankfully, I had a wonderful advisor who helped keep me on track. But it is more difficult than I imagined, and I was warned by Professor Elliott and by many thesis writers past that it's difficult to keep yourself on track, but I think, as is everyone's nature, you assume you'll be the one person to do it right, and I wasn't. I think I learned the importance of staying diligent on a self-imposed schedule, and learned that you're just not going to write the pages you think you're going to write during spring break, and you're not going to write a chapter when you're at the beach. It's fine. Just schedule around it.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I think for me, the most valuable thing that I learned was the process of setting up a research question and an experiment to sort of carry out that research question. Because the number of versions that my introduction and sort of setup of my thesis went through was enormous. And I really learned a lot about doing political science research and how to set up a social science experiment.
Great. I also have a general question for the panel. So I think these are terrific theses, terrific presentations, and they I would think that through the course of this research, you've all maybe come to see the world in just a slightly different way, or maybe a very different way from how you saw it when you started. And I wonder whether you could identify, outside of the specific geographic focus of your theses, are there other things going on in the world or in the news that you feel you see differently today, or that your work has shed light on that you think is really worth underscoring? In a way, I'm asking, how much do you feel that your specific work travels to other kinds of cases?
I can
Go ahead,
begin,
Isabella.
because
Yeah, go ahead.
I think everyone else has gotten the brunt of having to answer first. I would say for me, in terms of generality, I understand, I think, the nuances and the different definitions of democracy in a completely new way. I think, despite being an IR major, I think I've come away from 4 years just with democracy as a catch-all, and that's certainly not true. And I think it has helped shed light on those, like, the building blocks of a democracy, and building blocks of, as I mentioned, the quality of democracy and democratization. All three of which are different terms with a lot of nuance involved. But when I read the news now, I was recently reading about the elections in Guatemala, and it was no longer the elections in Guatemala pose a risk to Guatemalan democracy. It was the electoral procedures and the risk of corruption in government and the rule of law and the threat of organized crime. And I see things in a much more composite way, and I think hopefully I try and avoid generality in my future endeavors, and I think that that's something that I learned from this thesis.
Great, excellent.
Yeah, I think something that I learned that is more broadly applicable is the ways in which relationships between states manifest and can be observed, which is actually very difficult. It's not just whether states are in a traditional alliance or go to war with each other, okay, bad versus good, but the very little ways these relationships develop, whether it's phone calls about an issue, and we see that all the time, like which leaders are calling each other to congratulate on election results or visits. How often are these leaders meeting face to face? Small statements about the politics of other countries, finding out like which states opposed the protests in Hong Kong and therefore were sort of justifying China's actions on the international stage. I found that very interesting. So I think looking for nuance as a way to figure out what is friendship in international relations, what is cooperation, is very interesting. And I think looking at those little things more than just like the big quantitative numbers is a very interesting way to look at IR broadly.
Great. Catherine.
Yeah, so I think I've really gained a sort of perspective of looking at the variations and nuance of sort of situations where we understand there to be sort of a binary of big power players, and how there might be other players and factors that can provide more, the study of which can provide more insights into a situation and historical context. And I also think that I learned, not in a deterministic way, but thinking about the way that a broader context of what's happening in the world influences the decisions made by nation states and also the people on the ground who are making their decisions about their connections to those nation states.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Any final questions? Well, with that, please join me in congratulating a terrific thesis writer. Thank you all. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Professor Claudia Elliott.
Just what is left to send everyone home? No, I do really wonder these were great kind of final answers here, these general questions and general answers. So I'll just say a few things in closing. Again, I'd like to extend a warm congratulations to this panel and to the previous two panels for their outstanding work and their outstanding presentations on these complex issues that face us daily, that are front page in the news, many of them. I do hope you all return tomorrow for another display of this exceptional undergraduate research from IAPA concentrators. I'd also like to extend a deep note of gratitude to those who supported these students, the faculty advisors, the dedicated library staff, deans of the college. I see Dean Dunleavy in the audience right now, the Watson Institute, and other units on campus who have given generously funding for undergraduate thesis research. And of course, the awesome IAPA staff, Anita Nestor, Alessandra Suarez, and who's not here with us today, and Jordan Smith. The presentations we've heard this afternoon are testament to the important work our students are doing on such a wide range of domestic and global concerns. Some of these students have been more interested in understanding a problem better, and they do that by questioning concepts, modifying or creating new frameworks, re-examining relationships. Others focus more intently on finding solutions by evaluating policies and making concrete recommendations. Regardless of the goal, however, in order to be successful in writing a thesis and receiving honors in the concentration, all students must learn to identify a research problem, learn to develop an interesting and important research question, which we've heard today is not the easiest thing, frame that question within existing scholarship and intellectual debates. In other words, they have to master that literature in order to contribute something fresh, something new to our knowledge. They also must apply, we've heard some of the newness here, their knowledge of a range of quantitative and qualitative methods. They must think comparatively across time, across cases, across regions of the world, and in some cases use multiple language skills. These are their research questions, their arguments sustained over 5 or 6 chapters, their plan of how to answer that question, their decisions regarding the quality of sources and what constitutes evidence, their findings, and their interpretation of those findings, what they mean not just for themselves, but for scholars and practitioners and for all of us. First and foremost, however, they have to have the passion about the topic, about the theme they're interested in, to pursue this project year-long. And some of the presenters today have told us where that passion has come from. A very private personal experience, something learned from an internship, an experience or something that caught their eye while they were abroad, studying abroad, from a particular class, or from a general sense of indignity about something happening in the world. That's what initiates these projects, that's what sustains them, and what propels them forward, I think, after they leave Brown. Those of us who work with these students throughout the year have the best seat in the house. Not only do we get to watch their projects, maybe help them a little bit, transform from a vague initial idea and all of the changes that happen from the very beginning to a sophisticated product that in many ways looks a lot like some of the material, in some ways like some of the material they are reading for their classes. But we also watch the students transform into confident, rigorous researchers and thinkers, better writers and communicators. I think it's fair to say that these students are forever changed intellectually and personally in ways that will serve them well after they leave Brown. Congratulations again on such a high academic achievement.